Alrighty. Excuse me. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I am your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're continuing on with the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons, sorry. Tripping over my tongue this early? Baffling. Um, a quick warning to my longtime listeners for when you guys tune in. Um, that part 4 is not a mistype. You'll want to look for Wordy Wednesdays. I do not have it in the playlist yet, but I will by this weekend. So odds are, if you're listening to this and you're not tuning in on December 29th, 2023, you don't have to worry about this. But it's just a quick PSA. I did the interlude this past Wednesday. It's short. It's like an hour and change long, if that. So this is a particularly action-packed chapter. We're about to go into here. We've got another character background story. I may not have to do an interlude next week, actually, because it's very little interlude material. It's like 2.5 pages at most. And then it's one of the more consequential character stories, as it turns out. You wouldn't think it would be, but it very much is. Anyway, so yeah, we're about to get cracking on the Soldier's Tale, which is we learn more about Colonel Fedmahn Kassad and his backstory, as well as how he got his nickname, which we learned way back at the beginning. It's for a certain series of events that occur on a little planet called Brescia. Pretty sure they already. Yes, here we go. They did mention it back in the first chapter, or the prologue, one of the two. He is the so-called Butcher of South Brescia, and he is infamous for that. And we shall learn what that's all about. Okay, with that, I guess take your time to watch the previous segment, and because trust me, I will not be done by the time you all finish that. Um, and yeah, I don't think we'll need another interlude next week. The week after we might, because I believe there's a pretty significant interlude. But I will check. I know there are some interludes that are longer than others and will require midweek buttressing. Okay, with that, I'll quit my gabbing and we'll get cracking. Alrighty, give me a sec here and we'll roll with the flow. The Soldier's Tale. The War Lovers. It was during the Battle of Agincourt that Fedmahn Kassad encountered the woman he would spend the rest of his life seeking. It was a wet and chilly late October morning in AD 1415. Kassad had been inserted as an archer into the army of Henry V of England. The English force had been on French soil since August 14th, and had been retreating from superior French forces since October 8th. Henry had convinced his war council that the army could beat the French in a forced march to the safety of Calais. They had failed. Now, as October 25th dawned grey and drizzly, 7,000 Englishmen, mostly bowmen, faced a force of some 28,000 French men-at-arms across a kilometre of muddy fields. Kassad was cold, tired, sick, and scared. He and the other archers had been surviving on little more than scavenged berries for the past week of the march, and almost every man on the line and almost every man on the line that morning was suffering from diarrhea. The air temperature was in the low 50s Fahrenheit, and Kassad had spent a long night trying to sleep on damp ground. He was impressed with the unbelievable realism of the experience. The Olympus Command School Historical Tactical Network was as far beyond regular stim sims as full-form holos were beyond tin types, but the physical sensations were so convincing, so real, that Kassad did not relish the thought of being wounded. There were tales of cadets receiving fatal wounds in the OCSHTN sims and being pulled dead from their immersion creches. Kassad and the other bowmen on Henry's right flank had been staring at the larger French force for most of the morning, when pennants waved, the 15th century equivalent of sergeant's braid, and the archers obeyed the king's command and began marching against the enemy. The ragged English line, stretching about 700 meters across the field from tree line to tree line, consisted of clusters of archers like Kassad's troop, interspersed with smaller groups of men-at-arms. The English had no formal cavalry, and most of the horses Kassad could see on his end of the field were carrying men clustered near the king's command group, 300 meters toward the center, or huddled around the Duke of York's position much closer to where Kassad and the other archers stood near the right flank. These command groups reminded Kassad of a Force Ground Mobile Staff HQ, only instead of the inevitable forest of comm antennae giving away their position, bright banners and pennants hung limp on pikes. An obvious artillery target, thought Kassad, and then reminded himself that this particular military nuance did not yet exist. Kassad noticed that the French had plenty of horses. He estimated 600 or 700 mounted men, formed in ranks on each of the French flanks, and a long line of cavalry behind the main battle line. Kassad did not like horses. He had seen holos and pictures, of course, but he had not encountered the animals themselves until this exercise, and the size, smell, and sound of them tended to be unnerving. Especially so when the damn quadrupeds were armored chest and head, shod in steel, and trained to carry armored men wielding 4 meters of lance. The English advance halted. Kassad estimated that his battle line was about 250 meters from the French. He knew from the experience of the past week that this was within longbow range, but he also knew that he would have to pull his arm half out of its socket to hold the pull. The French were shouting what Kassad assumed were insults. He ignored them as he and his silent comrades stepped forward from where they had planted their long arrows and found soft ground in which to drive their stakes. The stakes were long and heavy, and Kassad had been carrying his for a week. Almost 1.5 meters long, the clumsy thing had been sharpened at both ends. When the order first came down for all archers to find saplings and cut stakes, somewhere in the deep woods just after they had crossed the Somme, Kassad had wondered idly what the things were for. Now he knew. Every third archer carried a heavy mallet, and now they took turns driving their stakes in at a careful angle. Kassad pulled out his long knife, resharpened the end, which, even leaning, rose almost to his chest, and stepped back through the hedgehog of sharpened stakes to await the French charge. The French did not charge. Kassad waited with the others. His bow was strong, 48 arrows were planted in 2 clusters at his feet, and his feet were set properly. The French did not charge. The rain had stopped, but a cool breeze had come up, and what little body heat Kassad had generated by the short march and the task of driving stakes had been lost quickly. The only sounds were the metallic shufflings of men and horses, occasional mutterings or nervous laughs, the heavier thud of hooves as the French cavalry arranged itself, but still refused to charge. "Fuck this," said a grizzled yeoman a few feet from Kassad. "Those bastards have wasted our whole bleeding morning. They better piss or get off the pot." Kassad nodded. He was not sure if he was hearing and understanding Middle English or if the sentence had been in simple standard. He had no idea if the grizzled archer was another command school cadet, an instructor, or merely an artifact of the sim. He could not guess if the slang had been correct. He did not care. His heart was pounding and his palms were sweaty. He wiped his hands on his jerkin. As if King Henry had taken his cue from the old man's muttering, command flags suddenly bobbed and rose, sergeants screamed, and row upon row of English archers raised their longbows, pulled when commands were shouted, released on the next command. 4 waves of arrows comprised of more than 6,000 meter long chisel-pointed cloth-yard missiles seemed to hang in a cloud 30 meters up and fell on the French. There came the sound of horses screaming and 1,000 demented children pounding on 10,000 tin pots as the French men-at-arms leaned into the rain of arrows to let their steel helmets and their chest and shoulder armor take the brunt of the downpour. Kassad knew that in military terms little real damage had been done, and this was small solace to the occasional French soldier with 10 inches of arrow through his eye, or to the scores of horses leaping, tumbling, and crashing into one another, while their riders struggled to remove wooden shafts from the creatures' backs and flanks. The French did not charge. More commands were shouted. Kassad raised, readied, and loosed his arrow. Again and again. The sky darkened every 10 seconds. Kassad's arm and back ached from the punishing rhythm. He found that he felt neither elation nor anger. Freudian slip. He was doing his job. His forearm was raw. Again the arrows flew. And again. 15 of his first sheaf of 24-hour arrows were gone when a cry went up along the English line, and Kassad paused and glanced down while holding full pull. The French were charging. A cavalry charge was something beyond Kassad's experience. Watching 1,200 armored horses charging directly at him created internal sensations which Kassad found a bit unnerving. The charge took less than 40 seconds, but Kassad discovered that this was ample time for his mouth to go absolutely dry, his breathing to begin to have problems, and for his testicles to retreat completely into his body. If the rest of Kassad could have found a comparable hiding place, he would have seriously considered crawling into it. As it was, he was too busy to run. Firing on command, his line of archers got off 5 flat volleys at the attacking horsemen. managed one more shot in independent fire, and then they fell back 5 paces. Horses, it turned out, were too smart to willingly impale themselves upon stakes, no matter how hard their human riders implored them to do so. But the second and third waves of cavalry did not stop as abruptly as the first, and in a single mad moment horses were down and screaming, riders were thrown and screaming, and Kassad was out and screaming, rushing at every downed Frenchman he could see, wielding a mallet on the prostrate form when he could, slashing through gaps in armor with his long knife when it was too crowded to swing the mallet. Soon he and the grizzled archer and a younger man who had lost his cap became an efficient killing team, closing in on a downed rider from 3 sides. Kassad using the mallet to knock the pleading horseman off his knees, and then all three moving in with their blades. Only one knight gained his feet and raised a sword to confront them. The Frenchman flipped up his visor and called out a clear request for honor and single combat. The old man and the youth circled like wolves. Kassad returned with his bow and put an arrow into the knight's left eye from 10 paces. The battle continued in the deadly comic opera vein common to all armed combat since the first rock and thigh-bone duels on old Earth. The French cavalry managed to turn and flee just as the first wave of 10,000 men-at-arms charged the English centre on foot. The melee broke up the rhythm of the attack, and by the time the French had regained their initiative, Henry's own men-at-arms had braced to hold them at pike length, while Kassad and several thousand other archers poured volley fire into the massed French infantry at close range. That did not end the battle. It was not necessarily even the decisive moment. The turning point, when it came, was lost, as all such moments are, within the dust and turmoil of 1,000 individual encounters, where infantrymen faced infantrymen across the distance of their personal weapons. Before it was over, some 3 hours later, there would be minor variations on repeated themes, ineffective thrusts and clumsy counter-thrusts, and a less than honorable moment when Henry would order prisoners killed rather than leave them in the rear when the English were confronted with a new threat. But the heralds and historians would later agree that the outcome had been sealed somewhere in the confusion during the first French infantry charge. The French died in the thousands. English dominion on that part of the continent would continue for a while. The day of the armored man-at-arms, the knight, the embodiment of chivalry, was over. Hammered into history's coffin by a few thousand ragtag peasant archers carrying longbows. The ultimate insult to the noble-born French dead, if the dead could indeed be further insulted, lay in the fact that the English archers were not only common men, common in the lowest, most flea-infested sense of the word, but they were draftees, doughboys, GIs, grunts, AIPs, spezzes, K-techs, jump rats. But all that was in the lesson Kassad was supposed to have learned during that OCS-HTN exercise. He learned none of it. He was too busy having an encounter which would change his life. The French man-at-arms went over the head of his falling horse, rolled once, and was up and running for the woods before the mud quit flying. Kassad followed. He was halfway to the tree line before he realized that the youth and the grizzled archer had not come with him. It did not matter. Kassad's adrenaline was flowing, and the bloodlust had him in its grip. The man-at-arms, who had just been thrown to the ground from a horse moving at full gallop and who was wearing 60 pounds of clumsy armor, should have been an easy prey to catch. He was not. The Frenchman glanced back once, saw Kassad coming on a full run with a mallet in his hand and his eye full of business, and then the man-at-arms shifted into a higher gear and reached the trees 15 meters ahead of his pursuer. Kassad was deep into the woods before he stopped, leaned on the mallet, gasped, and considered his position. Thuds, screams, and crashes from the battlefield behind him were muffled by distance and shrubbery. The trees were almost bare and still dripped from the rainstorm the night before. The floor of the forest was carpeted with a thick layer of old leaves and a snarl of shrubs and brambles. The man-at-arms had left a trail of broken branches and footsteps for the first 20 meters or so, but now deer trails and overgrown paths made it difficult to see where he had passed. Kassad moved slowly, stepping deeper into the woods, trying to be alert for any noise above the sound of his own panting and the insane pounding of his heart. It occurred to Kassad that, tactically speaking, this was not a brilliant move. The man-at-arms had been wearing full armor and carrying his sword when he disappeared in the bushes. At any moment the Frenchman might forget his panic, regret his temporary loss of honor, and remember his years of combat training. Kassad also had been trained. He looked down at his cloth shirt and leather vest. The mallet was still in his hands, the knife in his broad belt. He had been trained to use high-energy weapons with a killing range of a few meters to thousands of kilometers. He had been rated in plasma grenades, hell whips, flechette rifles, sonics, recoilless zero-gravity weapons, death wands, kinetic assault guns, and beam gauntlets. He now had a working knowledge of an English longbow. None of these objects, including the longbow, was on his person at the moment. "Ah, shit," murmured Second Lieutenant Kassad. The man-at-arms came out of the bushes like a charging bear, arms up, legs apart, the sword coming around in a flat arc meant to disembowel Kassad. The OCS cadet tried to leap back and raise his mallet at the same time. Neither effort was completely successful. The Frenchman's sword knocked the heavy mallet out of Kassad's grip, while the dull point of the blade slashed through leather, shirt, and skin. Kassad bellowed and stumbled backward again, tugging at the knife in his belt. His right heel caught the branch of a fallen tree, and he went down backward, cursing and rolling deeper into the tangle of branches as the man-at-arms crashed forward, his heavy sword clearing limbs like an oversized machete. Kassad had his knife out by the time the man-at-arms had cleared a path through the deadfall, but the 10-inch blade was a pitiful thing against armor, unless the knight was helpless. This knight was not helpless. Kassad knew that he would never get inside the arc of the sword blade. His only hope was in running, but the tall trunk of the fallen tree behind him and the deadfall beyond eliminated that option. He did not wish to get cut down from behind as he turned, nor from below as he climbed. Kassad did not wish to be cut down from any angle. Kassad went into a knife fighter's crouch, which he hadn't used since his street fighting days in the Tharsis slums. He wondered how the simulation would deal with his death. The figure appeared behind the man-at-arms like a sudden shadow. The noise of Kassad's mallet striking the knight's armored shoulder sounded precisely like someone bashing the hood of an EMV with a sledgehammer. The Frenchman staggered, turned to meet the new threat, and took a second mallet blow in the chest. Kassad's savior was small. The man-at-arms did not go down. The French knight was raising his sword above his head when Kassad hit him from behind and below the knees with a shoulder tackle. Three limbs snapped as the Frenchman went down. The small attacker stood astride the knight, pinning the armored man's sword arm with one foot while bringing the mallet down repeatedly onto helmet and visor. Kassad extricated himself from the tangle of legs and branches, sat on the downed man's knees, and began slashing through gaps in the armor at groin, sides, and underarms. Kassad's rescuer jumped aside to plant both feet on the knight's wrist, and Kassad scrambled forward, stabbing through crevices where the helmet met chest armor, finally slamming the blade through the slits of the visor itself. The knight screamed as the mallet came down a final time, almost catching Kassad's hand as the hammer drove the blade through the visor slit like a 10-inch tent peg. The man-at-arms arched, lifting Kassad and 60 pounds of armor clear off the ground in a final violent spasm, and then fell back limply. Kassad rolled onto his side. His rescuer collapsed beside him. Both were covered with sweat and the dead man's blood. Kassad looked at his savior. The woman was tall and dressed in clothes not dissimilar to Kassad's. For a moment they merely lay there and gasped for air. "Are you all right?" Kassad managed after a while. He was suddenly struck by her appearance. Her brown hair was short by current World Web fashion, short and straight and cut so that the longest strands fell from the part, just a few centimeters left of the center of her forehead, to just above her right ear. It was a boy's haircut from some forgotten time, but she was no boy. Kassad thought that she was perhaps the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, bone structure so perfect that chin and cheekbones were shaped without being too sharp, large eyes glowing with life and intelligence, a gentle mouth with a soft underlip. Lying next to her, Kassad realized that she was tall. Not so tall as he, but obviously not a woman from the 15th century. Not even under her loose tunic and baggy trousers could he see this. And even under her loose tunic and baggy trousers, he could see the soft swell of hips and breast. She appeared to be a few years older than Kassad, perhaps in her late 20s, but this fact barely registered as she continued staring into his face with those soft, beguiling, endlessly deep eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked again. His voice sounded strange even to himself. She did not answer. Or rather, she answered by sliding long fingers across Kassad's chest, ripping away the leather thongs which bound the rough vest. Her hands found his shirt. It was soaked with blood and ripped halfway down the front. The woman ripped it open the rest of the way. She moved against him now, her fingers and lips on his chest, hips already beginning to move. Her right hand found the cords to his trouser front, ripped them free. Kassad helped her pull off the rest of his clothes, removed hers with 3 fluid movements. She wore nothing under her shirt and coarse cloth trousers. Kassad's hand slid between her thighs, behind her, cupped her moving buttocks, pulled her closer, and slid to the moist roughness in front. She opened to him, her mouth closing on his. Somehow, with all of their motion and disrobing, their skin never lost contact. Kassad felt his own excitement rubbing against the cusp of her belly. She rolled above him then, her thighs astride his hips, her gaze still locked with his. Kassad had never been so excited. He gasped as her right hand went behind her, found him, guided him into her. When he opened his eyes again, she was moving slowly, her head back, eyes closed. Kassad's hands moved up her sides to cup her perfect breasts. Nipples hardened against his palms. They made love then. Kassad, at 23 standard years, had been in love once and enjoyed sex many times. He thought he knew the way and the why of it. There was nothing in his experience to that moment which he could not have described with a phrase and a laugh to his squad mates in the hold of a troop transport. With the calm, sure cynicism of a 23-year-old veteran, he was sure that he would never experience anything that could not be so described, so dismissed. He was wrong. He could never adequately share the sense of the next few minutes with anyone else. He would never try. They made love in a sudden shaft of late October light, with a carpet of leaves and clothes beneath them, and a film of blood and sweat oiling the sweet friction between them. Her green eyes stared down at Kassad, widening slightly when he began moving quickly, closing the same second he closed his. They moved together then in the sudden tide of sensation as old and inevitable as the movement of worlds, pulses racing, flesh quickening with its own moist purposes, a further, final rising together, the world receding to nothing at all. And then, still joined by touch and heartbeat and the fading thrill of passion, allowing consciousness to slide back to separate flesh, while the world flowed in through forgotten senses. They lay next to each other. The dead man's armor was cold against Kassad's left arm, her thigh warm against his right leg. The sunlight was a benediction. Hidden colors rose to the surface of things. Kassad turned his head and gazed at her as she rested her head on his shoulder. Her cheeks glowed with flush and autumn light, and her hair lay like copper threads along the flesh of his arm. She curved her leg over his thigh, and Kassad felt the clockwise stirring of renewed passion. The sun was warm on his face. He closed his eyes. When he awoke, she was gone. He was certain that only seconds had passed, no more than a minute, certainly, but the sunlight was gone, colors had flowed out of the forest, and the cool evening breeze moved bare branches. Kassad, dressed in torn clothes made stiff with blood. The French man-at-arms lay still and rigid in the unself-conscious attitude of death. He already seemed inanimate, a part of the forest. There was no sign whatsoever of the woman. Fedmahn Kassad limped his way back through the woods, in evening gloom and a sudden, chilling drizzle. The battlefield still held people, living and dead. The dead lay in heaps like the piles of toy soldiers Kassad had played with as a child. Wounded men moved slowly with the help of friends. Here and there furtive forms picked their way among the dead. And near the opposite tree line a lively group of heralds, both French and English, met in conclave with much pointing and animated conversation. Kassad knew that they had to decide upon a name for the battle so that their respective records would agree. He also knew that they would settle on the name of the nearest castle, Agincourt, even though it had figured in neither strategy nor battle. Kassad was beginning to think that this was no simulation, that his life in the world web was the dream, and that this gray day had to be reality, when suddenly the entire scene froze with the outlines of human figures, horses, and the darkening forest becoming as transparent as a fading hollow. And then Kassad was being helped out of his simulation crash at the Olympus Command School, and the other cadets and instructions were rising, talking, laughing with one another, all seemingly unaware that the world had changed forever. For weeks Kassad spent every free hour wandering in command school grounds, watching from the ramparts as the evening shadow of Mons Olympus covered first the plateau forest, then the heavily settled highlands, then everything halfway to the horizon, and then all the world. And every second he thought about what had happened. He thought about her. No one else had noticed anything strange in the simulation. No one else had left the battlefield. One instructor explained that nothing beyond the battlefield existed in that particular segment of the simulation. No one had missed Kassad. It was as if the incident in the forest and the woman had never happened. Kassad knew better. He attended his classes on military history and mathematics. He put in his hours at the firing range and gym. He walked off barracks punishments on the Caldera Quadrangle, although these were rare. In general, young Kassad became an even more excellent officer cadet than he had been. But all the while, he waited. And then she came again. Morning, morning, Warren Steele. Thanks for tuning in. Sorry I didn't see your message earlier. Again, it was in the final hours of an OCS HTN simulation. By then, Kassad had learned that the exercises were something more than mere simulations. The OCS HTN was part of the World Web All Thing, the real-time network which governed hegemony politics, fed information to tens of billions of data-hungry citizens, and had evolved a form of autonomy and consciousness all its own. More than 150 planetary dataspheres mingled their resources within the framework created by 6,000 Omega-class AIs to allow the OCS HTN to function.
The HTN stuff doesn't simulate,
Whined Cadet Radinsky, the best AI expert Kassad could find and bribe to explain.
It dreams with the best historical accuracy in the web, way beyond the sum of its parts, because it plugs in holistic insight as well as facts. And when it dreams, it lets us dream with it.
Kassad had not understood, but he had believed. And then she came again. In the first US-Vietnam War, they made love in the aftermath of an ambush during the darkness and terror of a night patrol. Kassad wore rough camouflage clothes, with no underwear because of the jungle crotch rot, and a steel helmet not much more advanced than those at Agincourt. She wore black pajamas and sandals, the universal garb of the Southeast Asian peasant, and the Viet Cong. Then neither of them wore anything as they made love standing in the night, her back against a tree and her legs wrapped around him, while beyond them the world exploded in the green glow of perimeter flares and the sputter crack of claymores. She came to him on the second day of Gettysburg, and again at Borodino, where the clouds of powder smoke hung above the piles of bodies like a vapor congealed from the departing souls. They made love in the shattered hulk of an APC in Hellas Basin, while the hover tank battle still raged, and the red dust of the approaching simoon scraped and shrieked at the titanium hull. "Tell me your name," he had whispered in Standard. She shook her head. "Are you real, outside the simulation?" he asked in the Japanese English of that era. She had nodded and leaned closer to kiss him. They lay together in a sheltered space among the ruins of Brasilia, while death beams from Chinese EMVs played like blue searchlights on broken ceramic walls. During an unnamed battle after a siege of a forgotten tower city on the Russian steppes, he pulled her back into the shattered room where they had made love, and he whispered, "I want to stay with you." She touched his lips with a finger and shook her head. After the evacuation of New Chicago, as they lay on the 100th floor balcony where Kassad had set his sniper's nest for the last US President's hopeless rear guard action, he placed his hand on the warm flesh between her breasts and said, "Can you ever join me out there?" She touched his cheek with her palm and smiled. During the last year in command school, there were only 5 OCS HTN sims as the cadets' training shifted to live field exercises. Sometimes, as when Kassad was strapped into the tactical command chair during a battalion-sized drop on Ceres, he closed his eyes, looked between the primary colored geographies of the cortically generated tactical terrain matrix, and felt a sense of someone? Of her? He was not sure. And then she did not come again. Not in the final months of work, not in the final simulation of the great coal sack battle where General Horace Glennon Height's mutiny was defeated. Not during the parades and parties of graduation, nor as the class marched in a final Olympian review before the hegemony CEO, saluting from his red-lit levitation deck. And there was no time even for dreaming, as the young officers forecast to Earth's moon for the Masada ceremony, forecast again to Tau Ceti Center for their formal swearing in to force, and then they were finished. Second Lieutenant Cadet Kassad became Lieutenant Kassad, spent 3 standard weeks free in the web with a force-issued universal card, which allowed him to forecast as far and as frequently as he wished, and then he was shipped out to the Hegemony Colonial Service Training School on Lusus to prepare for active duty beyond the web. He was sure that he would never see her again. He was wrong. Fedmahn Kassad had grown up in a culture of poverty and sudden death. As a member of the minority who still called themselves Palestinians, he and his family had lived in the slums of Tharsis, human testimony to the bitter legacy of the terminally dispossessed. Every Palestinian in the world web and beyond carried the cultural memory of a century of struggle, capped by a month of nationalist triumph before the nuclear jihad of 2038 wiped it all away.
Note that date on your clocks, ladies and gents. I think we're going to beat it.
Then came their second diaspora, this one lasting 5 centuries and leading to dead-end desert worlds like Mars, their dream buried with the death of old Earth. Kassad, like the other boys of the South Tarsis relocation camps, either ran with gangs or faced the option of being prey to every self-proclaimed predator in the camps. He chose to run with the gangs. Kassad had killed another youth by the time he was 16 standard years old. If Mars was known for anything in the world web, it was for hunting in the Mariner Valley, Schroeder's Zen Massif in Hellas Basin, and the Olympus Command School. Kassad did not have to travel to Mariner Valley to learn about hunting and being hunted. He had no interest in Zen Gnosticism, and as a teenager he felt nothing but contempt for the uniformed cadets who came from every part of the web to train for force. He joined with his peers in sneering at the new Bushido as a code for faggots, but an ancient vein of honor in the young Kassad's soul secretly resonated to the thought of a samurai class whose life and work revolved around duty, self-respect, and the ultimate value of one's word. When Kassad was 18, a Tharsis province higher circuit judge offered him the choice of a Martian year at Polar Work Camp or volunteering for the John Carter Brigade, then forming to help force put down the resurgent Glennonite rebellion in the Class 3 colonies. Kassad volunteered and discovered that he enjoyed the discipline and cleanliness of military life, even though the John Carter Brigade saw only garrison duty within the web and was dissolved shortly after Glennonite's cloned grandson died on Renaissance. 2 days after his 19th birthday, Kassad applied to force ground and was turned down. He went on a 9-day drunk, awoke in one of the deeper hive tunnels of Lusus with his military comlog implant stolen by someone who apparently had taken a correspondence course in surgery, his universal card and forecaster access revoked, and his head exploring new frontiers of pain. Kassad worked on Lusus for a standard year, saving over 6,000 marks and allowing physical labor in the 1.3 Earth standard gravity to put an end to his Martian frailness. By the time he used his savings to ship out to Maui Covenant on an ancient solar sail freighter with jury-rigged Hawking drives, Kassad was still lean and tall by web standards, but what muscles there were worked wonderfully well by anyone's standards.
He arrived on Maui Covenant 3 days before the vicious and unpopular Island War began there, and eventually the Force Combined commander at first sight got so tired of seeing the young Kassad waiting in his outer office that he allowed the boy to enlist in the 23rd Supply Regiment as an assistant hydrofoil driver. 11 standard months later, Corporal Fedmahn Kassad of the 12th Mobile Infantry Battalion had received 2 Distinguished Service Clusters, a Senate Commendation for Valor in the Equatorial Archipelago campaign, and 2 Purple Hearts. He was also tapped for Force Command School and shipped webward on the next convoy.
Kassad dreamed of her often.
He had never learned her name, she had never spoken, but he could have recognized her touch and scent in total darkness among 1,000 others. He thought of her as mystery. When other young officers went whoring or seeking girlfriends in the indigene populations, Kassad would remain on base or take long walks through strange cities. He kept his obsession with mystery secret, knowing full well how it would read on a psych report. Sometimes, on bivouac under multiple moons or in the womb-like zero-G of a troop transport hold, Kassad would realize how insane his love affair with a phantom truly was. But then he would recall the small mole under her left breast, which he had kissed one night, feeling her heartbeat under his lips as the ground itself shook from the firing of the big guns near Verdun. He would remember the impatient gesture with which she brushed back her hair as her cheek rested on his thigh. And the young officers would go to town or to the huts near the base, and Fedmahn Kassad would read another history book, or jog along the perimeter, or run tactical strategies on his comlog. It was not long before Kassad came to the attention of his superiors. During the undeclared war with the free miners in the Lambert Ring territories, it was Lieutenant Kassad who led the surviving infantry troops and marine guards in cutting through the bottom of the old asteroid bore shaft on Peregrine to evacuate the hegemony consulate staff and citizens. But it was during the short reign of the new prophet on Comriad that Captain Fedmahn Kassad came to the attention of the entire web. The Force Space Captain of the only hegemony ship within 2 leap years of the colony world had been paying a courtesy call when the new prophet chose to lead 30 million New Order Shiites against 2 continents of Sunni shopkeepers and 90,000 resident hegemony infidels. The ship's captain and 5 of his executive officers were taken prisoner. Urgent fatline messages from Tau Ceti Center demanded that the ranking officer aboard the orbiting HS Deniev settle the situation on Comriad, free all hostages, and depose the new prophet, without resorting to the use of nuclear weapons within the planet's atmosphere. The Deniev was an aging orbital defense picket. It carried no nuclear weapons that could be used within an atmosphere. The ranking officer on board was Force Combined Captain Fedmahn Kassad. On the 3rd day of the revolution, Kassad landed the Deniev's single assault boat in the main courtyard of the Grand Mosque at Mashhad. He and the other 34 Force troopers watched as the mob grew to 300,000 militants, kept at bay only by the boat's containment field and the lack of an order to attack by the new prophet. The new prophet himself was no longer in the Grand Mosque. He had flown to the northern hemisphere of Riyadh to join in the victory celebrations there. 2 hours after he landed, Captain Kassad stepped out of his ship and broadcast a short announcement. He said that he had been raised as a Muslim. He also announced that interpretation of the Quran since the Shiites' seed ship days had definitely shown that the God of Islam would neither condone nor allow the slaughter of the innocent, no matter how many jihads were proclaimed by tin horn heretics like the new prophet. Captain Kassad gave the leaders of the 30 million zealots 3 hours to surrender their hostages and return to their homes on the desert continent of Qom. In the first 3 days of the revolution, the armies of the new prophet had occupied most of the cities on 2 continents and had taken more than 27,000 hegemony hostages. Firing squads had been busy day and night settling ancient theological disputes, and it was estimated that at least 250,000 Sunnis had been slaughtered in the first 2 days of the new prophet's occupation. In response to Kassad's ultimatum, the new prophet announced that all of the infidels would be put to death immediately following his live television address that evening. He also ordered an attack on Kassad's assault boat. Avoiding high explosives because of the Grand Mosque, the Revolutionary Guard used automatic weapons, crude energy cannon, plasma charges, and human wave attacks. The containment field held. The new prophet's televised address began 15 minutes before Kassad's ultimatum ran out. The new prophet agreed with Kassad's statement that Allah would horribly punish heretics, but announced that it was the hegemony infidels who would be so punished. It was the only time the new prophet ever had been seen to lose his temper on camera. Screaming, saliva flying, he ordered the human wave attacks to be renewed on the grounded assault boat. He announced that at that moment, 12 fission bombs were being assembled at the occupied Power for Peace reactor in Ali. With these, the forces of Allah would be carried into space itself. The first fission bomb, he explained, would be used on the infidel Kassad's satanic assault boat that very afternoon. The new prophet then began to explain exactly how the hegemony hostages would be executed. But at that moment, Kassad's deadline ran out. Riyadh was, by its own choice and the accident of its distant location, a technically primitive world. But the inhabitants were not so primitive that they did not have an active datasphere. Nor were the revolutionary mullahs who had led the invasion so opposed to the great Satan of hegemony science that they refused to tie down the global data net with their personal comlogs. The HS Denyev had seeded enough spysats so that by 1729 hours Riyadh Central Time, the datasphere had been tapped to the point that the hegemony ship had identified 16,830 revolutionary mullahs by their access codes. At 1729 hours and 30 seconds, the spysats began feeding their real-time targeting data to the 21 perimeter defense sats which Kassad's assault boat had left in low orbit. These orbital defense weapons were so old that the Denyev's mission had been to return them to the web for safe destruction. Kassad had suggested another use for them. At precisely 1730 hours, 19 of the small satellites detonated their fusion cores. In the nanoseconds before their self-destruction, the resulting X-rays were focused, aimed, and released in 16,830 invisible but very coherent beams. The ancient defense sats were not designed for atmospheric use, but had an effective destructive radius of less than a millimeter. Luckily, that was all that was needed. Not all of the targeting beams penetrated whatever stood between the mullahs and the sky. 15,784 did. The effect was immediate and dramatic. In each case, the target's brain and cerebral fluid boiled, turned to vapor, and blew the encasing skull to bits. The new prophet was in the middle of his live planet-wide broadcast, literally in the middle of pronouncing the word heretic, when 1730 hours arrived. For almost 2 minutes, the TV screens and walls around the planet carried the image of the new prophet's headless body slumped over the microphone. Then Fedmahn Kassad cut in on all bands to announce that his next deadline was 1 hour away, and that any actions against the hostages would be met with more dramatic demonstrations of Allah's displeasure. There were no reprisals. That night, in orbit around Comriad, mystery visited Kassad for the first time since his cadet days. He was asleep, but the visit was more than a dream, and less than the alternative reality of the OCS HTN Sims. The woman and he were lying together under a light blanket beneath a broken roof. Her skin was warm and electric, her face little more than a pale outline against nighttime darkness. Overhead, the stars had just begun to fade into the false light of pre-dawn. Kassad realized that she was trying to speak to him. Her soft lips formed words which were just below the threshold of Kassad's hearing. He pulled back a second time. He pulled back a second in order to see her face better, and in so doing lost contact completely. He awoke in his sleep webbing with moisture on his cheeks and the hum of the ship's systems sounding as strange to him as the breathing of some half-awakened beast. Nine standard ship weeks later, Kassad stood before a force court-martial review on Freeholm. He had known when he made his decision on Comriad that his superiors would have no choice but to crucify or promote him. Force prided itself on preparing itself for all contingencies in the web or the colonial regions, but nothing had properly prepared it for the Battle of South Brescia and its implications for the new Bushido. The new Bushido Code, which governed Colonel Kassad's life, had evolved out of the necessity for the military class to survive. After the obscenities of the late 20th and early 21st centuries on Old Earth, when military leaders had committed their nations to strategies wherein entire civilian populations were legitimate targets, while their uniformed executioners sat safe in self-contained bunkers 50 meters under the earth, the repugnance of the surviving civilians was so great that for more than a century the word military was an invitation to a lynching. As the new Bushido evolved, it combined the age-old concepts of honor and individual courage with the need to spare civilians whenever possible. It also saw the wisdom of returning to the pre-Napoleonic concepts of small, non-total wars, with defined goals and proscribed excesses. The Code demanded a forsaking of nuclear weapons and strategic bombing campaigns in all but the most extreme cases, but, more than that, it demanded a return to old Earth medieval concepts of set battles between small professional forces at a mutually agreed upon time in a place where destruction of public and private property would be kept to a minimum. This code worked well for the first 4 centuries of post-Hegira expansion. The fact that essential technologies were essentially frozen in place for 3 of those centuries worked in the hegemony's favor, as its monopoly on the use of forecasters allowed it to apply the modest resources of force at the right place in the required amount of time. Even when separated by the inevitable leap years of time debt, no colonial or independent world could hope to match the power of the hegemony. Incidents such as the political rebellion on Maui Covenant, with its unique guerrilla warfare, or the religious insanity on Comriad, were put down quickly and firmly, and any excesses in the campaigns merely pointed out the importance of returning to the strict code of New Bushido. But for all of Force's calculations and preparations, no one had adequately planned on the inevitable confrontation with the ousters. The ousters had been the single external threat to the hegemony for the 4 centuries since the forebears of the barbarian hordes had left Sol System in their crude fleet of leaking O'Neill cities, tumbling asteroids, and experimental comet farm clusters. Even after the ousters acquired the hawking drive, it remained official hegemony policy to ignore them as long as their swarms stayed in the darkness between the stars, and limited their in-system plunderings to scooping small amounts of hydrogen from gas giants and water ice from uninhabited moons. The early outback skirmishes, such as Bent's World and GHC 2990, were considered aberrations, of little interest to the hegemony. Even the pitched battle for Lee 3 had been treated as a colonial service problem. When the Force Task Force arrived, 6 local years after the attack, 5 years after the ousters departed, any atrocities were conveniently forgotten in favor of the view that no barbarian raid would repeat itself when the hegemony chose to flex its muscle. In the decades which followed Lee 3, Force and Ouster space forces skirmished in 100 border areas. But, except for the odd marine encounters in airless, weightless places, there were no infantry confrontations. Stories in the world web proliferated. The Ousters would never be a threat to Earth-like worlds because of their 3 centuries of adaptation to weightlessness. The Ousters had evolved into something more, or less, than human. The Ousters did not have Farcaster technology, would never have it, and thus never would be a threat to Force. Then came Brescia. Brescia was one of those smug, independent worlds, pleased with both its convenient access to the web and its 8-month separation from it, growing rich from the export of diamonds, burr root, and its unequaled coffee, coyly refusing to become a colony world, but still dependent upon the hegemony protectorate and common market to meet its soaring economic goals. As with most such worlds, Brescia was proud of its self-defense force. 12 torch ships, a refitted attack carrier which had been decommissioned by Force Space half a century earlier, 20 or more of small, fast orbital patrol vessels, a standing army of 90,000 volunteers, a respectable ocean-going navy, and a store of nuclear weapons stockpiled purely for symbolic purposes. The Ouster hawking wake had been noticed by hegemony monitoring stations, but was misinterpreted as merely another swarm migration which would pass no closer than half a light year to the Brescian system. Instead, with a single course correction which was not detected until the swarm was within the Oort cloud radius, the Ousters fell on Brescia like some Old Testament plague. A minimum of 7 standard months separated Brescia from any hegemony rescue or response. Brescia's space force was obliterated within the first 20 hours of fighting. The Ouster swarm would then put more than 3,000 ships into Brescia's cislunar space and began the systematic reduction of all planetary defenses. The world had been settled by no-nonsense Central Europeans in the first wave of the Hegira, and its 2 continents bore the prosaic names of North Brescia and South Brescia. North Brescia held desert, high tundra, and 6 major cities housing mostly burr root harvesters and petroleum engineers. South Brescia, much more temperate in climate and geography, was the home for most of the world's 400 million people, and the huge coffee plantations. As if to demonstrate what war had once been about, the Ousters scoured North Brescia, first with several hundred fallout-free nuclear weapons and tactical plasma bombs, then with death beams, and finally with tailored viruses. Only a handful of the 14 million residents escaped. South Brescia received no bombardment except for the lancing of specific military targets, airports, and the large harbor at Solno. Force doctrine held that, while a world could be reduced from orbit, actual military invasion of an industrialized planet was an impossibility. The problems with landing logistics, the immense area to be occupied, and the unwieldy size of the invading army were considered to be the ultimate arguments against invasion. The Ousters obviously had not read Force doctrine books. On the 23rd day of the investiture, more than 2,000 dropships and assault boats fell on South Brescia. What was left of the Brescian Air Force was destroyed in those first hours of the invasion. 2 nuclear devices were actually detonated against Auster staging areas. The first was deflected by energy fields, and the second destroyed a single scout ship, which may have been a decoy. Austers, it turned out, had changed physically in 3 centuries. They did prefer zero-gravity environments, but their mobile infantry's powered exoskeletons served very well, and it was only a matter of days before the black-clad, long-limbed Auster troops were swarming over South Brescia's cities like an infestation of giant spiders. The last organized resistance collapsed on the 19th day of the invasion. Buckminster, the capital, fell the same day. The last fat line message from Brescia to the hegemony was cut off in mid-transmission, an hour after Auster troops entered the city. Colonel Fedmahn Kassad arrived with Force Fleet 1 29 standard weeks later. 30 Omega-class torch ships protecting a single Farcaster-equipped jump ship penetrated the system at high speed. The Singularity Sphere was activated 3 hours after spin-down, and 10 hours after that there were 400 Force ships of the line in system. The counter-invasion began 21 hours later. Those were the mathematics of the first minutes of the Battle of Brescia. For Kassad, the memory of those days and weeks held not mathematics, but the terrible beauty of combat. It was the first time jump ships had been used on anything above a division level, and there was the expected confusion. Kassad went through from 5 light minutes out and fell into gravel and yellow dust. What? Oh, okay. Kassad went through from 5 light minutes out and then fell into gravel and yellow dust because the assault boat Farcaster portal was facing down a steep incline made slick with mud and the blood of the first squads through. Kassad lay in the mud and looked down the hillside at madness. 10 of the 17 Farcaster assault boats were down and burning, scattered across the foothills and plantation fields like broken toys. The containment fields of the surviving boats were shrinking under an onslaught of missile and CPB fire that turned the landing areas into domes of orange flame. Kassad's tactical display was a hopeless mess. His visor showed a garble of impossible fire vectors, blinking red phosphors where Force troops lay dying, and overlays of Auster jamming ghosts. Someone was screaming, "Oh, God damn it! God damn it! Oh, God damn it!" on his primary command circuit, and the implants registered a void where command group's data should be. An enlisted man helped him up. Kassad flicked mud off his command wand and got out of the way of the next squad forecasting through. And the war was on. From his first minutes on South Brescia, Kassad realized that the new Bushido was dead. 80,000 superbly armed and trained Force ground troops advanced from their staging areas, seeking battle in an unpopulated place. Auster forces retreated behind a line of scorched earth, leaving only booby traps and dead civilians. Force used Farcasters to outmaneuver the enemy, to force him to fight. The Austers responded with a barrage of nuclear and plasma weapons, pinning the ground troops on their force fields while the Auster infantry retreated to prepare defenses around cities and dropship staging areas. There were no quick victories in space to shift the balance on South Brescia. Despite feints and occasional fierce battles, the Austers retained complete control of everything within 3 AU of Brescia. Force space units fell back and concentrated on keeping the fleet within Farcaster range and protecting the primary jump ship. What had been forecast as a 2-day battle ground on for 30 days, then 60. Warfare had been thrown back to the 20th or 21st century. Long, grim campaigns fought through the brick dust of ruined cities over the corpses of civilians. The 80,000 original force troops were ground up, reinforced with 100,000 more, and were still being decimated when the call went out for 200,000 more. Only the grim resolve of Mina Gladstone and a dozen other determined senators kept the war alive and the troops dying, while the billions of voices of the All Thing and the AI Advisory Council called for disengagement. Kassad had understood the change of tactics almost at once. His street-fighting instincts had risen to the forefront even before most of his division was wiped out in the Battle of Stone Heap. While other force commanders were all but ceasing to function, frozen into indecision by this violation of the new Bushido, Kassad, in command of his regiment and in temporary command of his division after the nuking of Command Group Delta, was trading men for time and calling for the release of fusion weapons to spearhead his own counterattack. By the time the ousters withdrew 97 days after the forced rescue of Brescia, Kassad had earned the double-edged nickname of the Butcher of South Brescia. It was rumored that even his own troops were afraid of him. And Kassad dreamed of her, with dreams that were more and less than dreams. On the last night of the battle for Stoneheap, in the maze of dark tunnels where Kassad and his hunter-killer groups used sonics and T5 gas to flush out the last warrens of ouster commandos, the colonel fell asleep amid flame and screams, and felt the touch of her long fingers on his cheek, and the soft compression of her breasts against him. When they entered New Vienna on the morning after the space When they entered New Vienna on the morning after the space strike Kassad had called in, the troops following the glass-smooth 20-meter wide burn grooves into the lanced city, Kassad had stared without blinking at the rows of human heads lying on the pavement, carefully lined up as if to welcome the rescuing force troops with their accusatory stares. Kassad had returned to his command EMV, closed the hatches, and, curling up in the warm darkness smelling of rubber, heated plastics, charged ions, he had heard her whispers over the babble of the C3 channels and implant coding. On the night before the ouster retreat, Kassad left the command conference on the HS Brazil, forecast to his HQ in the Indelibles north of the Hine Valley, and took his command car to the summit to watch the final bombardment. The nearest of the tactical nuclear strikes was 45 kilometers away. The plasma bombs blossomed like orange and blood-red flowers planted in a perfect grid. Kassad counted more than 200 dancing columns of green light as the Hell Whip lances ripped the broad plateau to shreds. And even before he slept, while he sat on the flare skirt of the EMV and shook pale after-images from his eyes, she came. She wore a pale blue dress and walked lightly between the dead burr-root plants on the hillside. The breeze lifted the hem of the soft fabric of her dress. Her face and arms were pale, almost translucent. She called his name. He could almost hear the words. And then the second wave of bombardment rolled in across the plain below him, and everything was lost in noise and flame. As tends to be the case in a universe apparently ruled by irony, Fedmahn Kassad passed unscathed through 97 days of the worst fighting the hegemony had ever seen, only to be wounded 2 days after the last of the ousters had retreated to their fleeing swarm ships. He was in the Civic Center building in Buckminster, one of only 3 buildings left standing in the city, giving curt answers to stupid questions from a World Web news tape from when a plasma booby trap no larger than a micro switch exploded 15 floors above, blew the news tape and 2 of Kassad's aides through a ventilator grill into the street beyond, and dropped the building on him. Kassad was medevaced to Division HQ and then farcast to the jump ship now in orbit around Brescia's second moon. There he was resuscitated and put on full life support while the military brass and hegemony politicians decided what to do with him. Because of the Farcaster connection and the real-time media coverage of Brescia, Colonel Fedmahn Kassad had become somewhat of a cause célèbre. Those billions who had been appalled by the unprecedented savagery of the South Brescia campaign would have been pleased to see Kassad court-martialed or tried for war crimes. CEO Gladstone and many others considered Kassad and the other force commanders as saviors. In the end, Kassad was put on a hospital spin ship for the slow trip back to the web. Since most of the physical repair would be done in Fugue anyway, it made some sense to let the old hospital ships work on the seriously wounded and retrievable dead. By the time Kassad and the other patients reached the World Web, they would be ready for active duty. More importantly, Kassad would have accrued a time debt of at least 18 standard months, and whatever controversy surrounded him might well be over by that time. Kassad awoke to see the dark shape of a woman bending over him. For a second, he was sure that it was she, and then he realized that it was a force medic. "Am I dead?" he whispered.
You were. You're on the HS Merrick. You've been through resuscitation and renewal several times, but you probably don't remember because of the fugue hangover. We're ready to start the next step in physical therapy. Do you feel like trying to walk?
Kassad lifted his arm to cover his eyes. Even through the disorientation of fugue state, he now remembered the painful therapy sessions, the long hours in the RNA virus baths, and the surgery. Most of all, the surgery. Surgery. "What's our route?" he asked, still shielding his eyes. "I forget how we're getting back to the web." The medic smiled as if this were a question he asked each time he came out of fugue. Perhaps it was.
We'll be putting in at Hyperion and Garden, she said. We're just entering the orbit of...
The woman was interrupted by the sound of the end of the world. Great brass trumpets blowing, metal ripping, furies screaming. Kassad rolled off the bed, wrapping the mattress around him as he fell in 1/6 G. Hurricane winds slid him across the deck and hurled pitchers, trays, bedclothes, books, bodies, metal instruments, and countless other objects at him. Men and women were screaming, their voices rising through falsetto as the air rushed out of the ward. Kassad felt the mattress slam into the wall. He looked out between clenched fists. A meter from him, a football-sized spider with wildly waving legs was trying to force itself into a crack which had suddenly appeared in the bulkhead. The thing's jointless legs seemed to be swatting at the paper and other detritus whirling around it. The spider rotated, and Kassad realized that it was the head of the medic. She had been decapitated in the initial explosion. Her long hair writhed at Kassad's face. Then the crack widened to the width of a fist, and the head disappeared through it. Kassad pulled himself up just as the boom arm quit spinning, and up ceased to be. The only forces now in play were the hurricane winds still flinging everything in the ward toward the cracks and gaps in the bulkhead, and the sickening lurch and tumble of the ship. Kassad swam against it all, pulling himself toward the door to the boom arm corridor, using every handhold he could find, kicking free the last 5 meters. A metal tray struck him above the eye. A corpse with hemorrhaged eyes almost tumbled him back into the ward. The airtight emergency doors were slamming uselessly into a dead Marine whose spacesuited body blocked the seal from closing. Kassad rolled through into the boom arm shaft and pulled the corpse after him. The door sealed behind him, but there was no more air in the shaft than there had been in the ward. Somewhere a klaxon's scream thinned to inaudibility. Kassad also screamed, trying to relieve the pressure so that his lungs and eardrums would not burst. The boom arm was still draining air. He and the corpse were being sucked the 130 meters to the main body of the ship. He and the dead Marine tumbled along the boom arm shaft in a grisly waltz. It took Kassad 20 seconds to slap open the emergency releases on the Marine's suit, another minute to eject the man's corpse, and to get his own body in. He was at least 10 centimeters taller than the dead man, and although the suit was built to allow some expansion, it still pinched painfully at his neck and wrists and knees. The helmet squeezed his forehead like a cushioned vice. Gobbets of blood and a moist white material clung to the inside of the visor. The piece of shrapnel which had killed the Marine had left entrance and exit holes, but the suit had done its best to seal itself. Most of the chest lights were red, and the suit did not respond when Kassad ordered it to give a status report, but the rebreather worked, although with a worrying rasp. Kassad tried the suit radio. Nothing, not even background static. He found the comlog lead, jacked into a hull Termex. Nothing. The ship pitched again then, metal reverberating to a succession of blows, and Kassad was thrown against the wall of the boom arm shaft. One of the transport cages tumbled by, its severed cables whipping like the tentacles of an agitated sea anemone. There were corpses in the cage and more bodies tangled along the segments of spiral staircase, still intact, along the shaft wall. Kassad kicked the remaining distance to the end of the shaft and found all of the airtight doors there sealed. The boom arm shaft itself irised shut, but there were holes. Oh, let me restart the sentence. I'm sorry, I got lost. Kassad kicked the remaining distance to the end of the shaft and found all of the airtight doors there sealed. The boom arm shaft itself irised shut, but there were holes in the primary bulkhead large enough to drive a commercial EMV through. The ship lurched again and began to tumble more wildly, imparting complex new Coriolis forces to Kassad and everything else in the shaft. Kassad hung on torn metal and pulled himself through a rent in the triple hull of the H.S. Merrick. He almost laughed when he saw the interior. Whoever had lanced the old hospital ship had done it right, chopping and stabbing the hull with CPBs until pressure seals failed, self-seal units ruptured, damage control remotes overloaded, and the interior bulkheads collapsed. Then the enemy ship had put missiles into the guts of the Hulk with warheads of what the Force space people quaintly called canister shot. The effect had been quite similar to setting off an anti-personnel grenade in a crowded rat maze. Lights shone through 1,000 holes, here and there becoming colorful rays where they found a colloidal base in the floating haze of dust or blood or lubricant. From where Kassad hung, twisting with the lurch and tumble of the ship, he could see a score or more of bodies, naked and torn, each moving with the deceptive underwater ballet grace of the zero-gravity dead. Most of the corpses floated within their own small solar systems of blood and tissue. Several of them watched Kassad with the cartoon character stares of their pressure-expanded stares, and seemed to beckon him closer with random, languid movements of arms and hands. Kassad kicked through the wreckage to reach the main drop shaft to the command core. He had seen no weapons. It seemed that no one except the Marine had managed to suit up. But he knew that there would be a weapons locker in the command core, or in the Marine quarters aft. Kassad stopped at the last torn pressure seal and stared. He did laugh this time. Beyond this point, there was no main drop shaft, no aft section. There was no ship. This section, a boom arm and medical ward mod, a ragged chunk of the hull, had been ripped free of the ship as easily as Beowulf had torn the arm from Grendel's body. The final unsealed doorway to the drop shaft led to open space. Some kilometers away, Kassad could see a dozen other ravaged fragments of the HS Merrick tumbling in the glare of sunlight. A green and lapis planet loomed so close that Kassad felt a surge of acrophobia and clung more tightly to the door frame. Even as he watched, a star moved above the limb of the planet. Laser weapons winked their ruby Morse, and a gutted ship section half a kilometer away across the Gulf of Vacuum from Kassad burst again in a gout of vaporized metal, freezing volatiles, and tumbling black specks which Kassad realized were bodies. Kassad pulled himself deeper into the concealing tangle of wreckage and considered his situation. The marine suit could not last more than another hour. Already Kassad could smell the rotten eggs stench of the malfunctioning rebreather, and he had seen no airtight compartment or container during his struggle through the wreckage. And even if he found a closet or airlock to shelter in, what then? Kassad did not know if the planet below was Hyperion or Garden, but he was quite sure that there was no force presence on either world. He was also quite sure that no local defense forces would challenge an ouster warship. It would be days before any patrol craft investigated the wreckage. It was quite possible, Kassad knew, that the orbit of the tumbling piece of junk he now inhabited would decay before they sent anyone up to check on it, sending thousands of tons of twisted metal burning through the atmosphere. The locals would not like that, Kassad knew, but from their point of view it might be preferable to let a bit of sky fall than to agonize the ousters. If the planet had primitive orbital defenses or ground-based CPBs, he realized with a grim smile, it would make more sense for them to blast the wreckage than to fire on the ouster ship. It would make no difference to Kassad. Unless he did something quickly, he would be dead long before the remnants of the ship entered the atmosphere or the locals took action. The Marine's amplification shield had been cracked by the shrapnel which had killed him, but now Kassad tugged on what was left of the viewplate down over the visor. Telltales winked red, but there was still enough suit power to show the amplified view glowing pale green through the spiderweb of cracks. Kassad watched as the ouster torch ship stood off 100 clicks, its defense fields blurring background stars, and launched several objects. For an instant, Kassad was sure that these were the coup de grace missiles, and he found himself grinning joylessly at the certainty of having only a few seconds to live. Then he noticed their low velocity and notched the amplification higher. The power lights blinked red and the amplifier failed, but not before Kassad had seen the tapering ovoid shapes, spotted with thrusters and cockpit blisters, each trailing a tangle of 6 jointless manipulator arms. Squids, the Force Space people had called the ouster boarding craft. Kassad pulled himself farther back in the wreckage. He had only a few minutes before one or more of the squids reached his piece of the ship. How many ousters would one of those things carry? 10? 20? Kassad was sure it would be no fewer than 10. And they would be well armed and rigged with infrared and motion sensors. The elite ouster equivalent of hegemony space marines, the commandos would not only have been trained for freefall combat, but had been born and bred to zero-G. Their long limbs, prehensile toes, and prosthetic tails would be added advantages for this environment, although Kassad doubted that they needed any more advantages than they already had. He began to pull himself carefully back through the labyrinth of twisted metal, fighting the adrenaline fear surge that made him want to kick off screaming through the darkness. What did they want? Prisoners. That would solve his immediate survival problem. All he had to do was survive, then surrender. All he had to do to survive was surrender. The difficulty with that solution was that Kassad had seen the Force intelligence holos of the ouster ship they had captured off Brescia. There had been more than 200 prisoners in the storage bay of that ship, and the ousters obviously had many questions for these hegemony citizens. Perhaps they had found it inconvenient to feed and imprison so many, or perhaps it was their basic interrogation policy. But the fact was that the Brescian civilians and captured Force troops had been found flayed open and pinned down on steel trays like frogs in the biology lab, their organs bathed with nutrient fluids, arms and legs efficiently amputated, eyes removed, and their minds readied for interrogators' questions with crude cortical comm taps and shunt plugs jacked directly through 3-centimeter holes in the skulls. Kassad pulled himself along, floating through debris and the tangled entrails of the ship's wiring. He felt no inclination whatsoever to surrender. The tumbling hulk vibrated and then steadied some, as at least one of the squids attached itself to the hull or bulkhead. Think, Kassad commanded. He needed a weapon more than a hiding place. Had he seen anything during his crawl through the wreckage that would help him survive? Kassad stopped moving and hung from an exposed section of fiber optic cable while he thought. The medical ward where he had awakened, beds, fugue tanks, intensive care apparatus, most of it expelled through the breaches in the spin mod's hull. Boom arm shaft, elevator cage, corpses on the stairs. No weapons. Most of the bodies had been stripped by the canister shot explosions or sudden decompression. The elevator cables? No, too long. Impossible to sever without tools. Tools? He had seen none. The medical offices flayed open along the corridors beyond the main drop shaft. Medical imaging rooms, MRI tanks, and CPD bays flung open like looted sarcophagi. At least one operating room intact, its interior a maze of scattered instruments and floating cables. The solarium scraped clean when the windows exploded outward. Patient lounges, medics' lounges, the scrub rooms, corridors, and unidentifiable cubicles. The corpses. Kassad hung there a second longer, oriented himself in the tumbling maze of light and shadow, and then kicked off. He had hoped for 10 minutes. He was given less than 8. He knew that the ousters would be methodical and efficient, but had underestimated how efficient they could be in 0G. He gambled his life that there would be at least 2 of them on each sweep, basic Space Marine procedure, much as Force ground jump rats had learned to go door to door in city fighting, one to burst into each room, the other to provide cover fire. If there were more than 2, if the ousters worked in squads of 4, Kassad almost certainly would be dead. He was floating in the middle of operating room 3 when the ouster came through the door. Kassad's rebreather had all but failed. He was floating immobile, gasping foul air, as the ouster commando swung in, swung aside, and brought his 2 weapons to bear on the unarmed figure in a battered marine spacesuit. Kassad had bargained that the gruesome condition of his suit and visor would gain him a second or 2. Behind his gore-smeared faceplate, Kassad's eyes stared sightlessly upward as the ouster's chest light swept across him. The commando carried 2 weapons, a sonic stunner in one hand and a smaller but much more lethal tight-beam pistol in the long toes of his left foot. He raised the sonic. Kassad had time to notice the killing spike on the prosthetic tail, and then he triggered the mouse in his gauntleted right hand. It had taken Kassad most of his 8 minutes to tie the emergency generator to the operating room circuits. Not all of the surgery lasers had survived, but 6 still worked. Kassad had positioned 4 of the smaller ones to cover the area just to the left of the doorway, the 2 bone cutters to target the space to the right. The ouster had moved to the right. The ouster's suit exploded. The lasers continued to slice away in their pre-programmed circles as Kassad propelled himself forward, ducking under blue beams now swirling in a spreading mist of useless suit sealant and boiling blood. He wrestled the Sonic away just as the second ouster swung into the room, agile as an old Earth chimp. Kassad pressed the Sonic against the man's helmet and fired. The suited figure went limp. The prosthetic tail spasmed a few times from random nerve impulses. Triggering the Sonic that close was no way to take a prisoner. A burst from that distance turned a human brain into something resembling oatmeal mush. Kassad did not want to take a prisoner. He kicked free, grabbed the girder, swept the active Sonic across the open doorway. No one else came through.
Don't ask, by the way, how a sonic weapon works in vacuum. I don't really know. I don't think it does. If you push it against like their physical spacesuit, totally, absolutely, that'd do it. But at that point, it's like, well, then you can't really stun people. You just boil their brain, I guess. Whatever. Maybe it stuns your organs and knocks you out if you do it somewhere other than the noggin, or it's tunable. Anyway, it doesn't seem like a very practical weapon to use in vacuum at all. I don't get it. Anyway, back to just minor gripe. Minor question. He kicked free, grabbed the girder, swept the active Sonic across the open doorway. No one else came through. A check 20 seconds later showed an empty corridor. Kassad ignored the first body and stripped the man with the intact suit. The commando was naked under the spacesuit, and it turned out not to be a man. The female commando had short cropped blonde hair, small breasts, and a tattoo just above her line of pubic hair. She was very pale, and droplets of blood floated from her nose, ears, and eyes. Kassad made a note that the ousters used women in their marines. All of the ouster bodies on Brescia had been male. He kept his helmet and rebreather pack on as he kicked the body aside and tugged on the unfamiliar suit. Vacuum exploded blood vessels in his flesh. Deep cold nipped at him as he struggled with strange clasps and locks. Tall as he was too short for the woman's suit. He could operate the hand gauntlets by stretching, but the foot gloves and tail connections were hopeless. He let them hang useless as he bailed out of his own helmet and wrestled the ouster bubble into place. Lights in the collar disk key glowed amber and violet. Kassad heard the rush of air through aching eardrums and almost gag as a thick, rich stench assailed him. He assumed it was the sweet smell of home to an ouster. Earphone patches in the bubble whispered coded commands in a language which sounded like an audio tape of ancient English, played backward at high speed. Kassad was gambling again, this time on the fact that the ouster ground units on Brescia had functioned as semi-independent teams, united by voice radio and basic telemetry, rather than a force ground type of tactical implant web. If they used the same system here, then the commando leader might know that two of his or her troops were missing, possibly even have medcom readings on them, but might not know exactly where they were. Kassad decided that it was time to quit hypothesizing and to get moving. He programmed the mouse to have the surgical lasers fire on anything entering the operating room, and then Bounce stumbled his way down the corridor. Moving in one of these damn suits, he thought, was like trying to walk in a gravity field while standing on your own trousers. He had brought along both energy pistols and, finding no belt, lock rings, hooks, velcro pads, mag clamps, or pockets to secure them with, now floated along like some drunken holodrama pirate, a weapon in each hand, bouncing from wall to wall. Reluctantly, he left one pistol floating behind him while he tried to hook himself along one-handed. The gauntlet fit like a size 15 mitten on a size 2 hand. The damned tail wobbled, banged against his helmet bubble, and was a literal pain in the ass. Twice he squeezed into crevices when he saw lights in the distance. He was just about to
He was just about to the deck opening where he had watched the squid approach when he rounded the corner and almost floated into 3 ouster commandos. The fact that he was wearing an ouster suit gave him at least a 2-second advantage. He shot past the first suited figure in the helmet. He shot the first suited figure in the helmet at point-blank range. The second man, or woman, fired a wild sonic burst past Kassad's left shoulder, a second before he put 3 bolts into the ouster's chest plate. The third commando flipped backward, found 3 handholds, and was out of sight around a broken bulkhead before Kassad could retarget. His headset rang with curses, commands, and questions. Kassad gave silent chase. The third ouster would have escaped if he had not rediscovered honor and turned to fight. Kassad felt an inexplicable sense of déjà vu as he put an energy bolt through the man's left eye from 5 meters away. The corpse tumbled backward into sunlight. Kassad pulled himself to the opening and stared at the squid moored not 20 meters away. It was, he thought, the first undiluted piece of luck he had had in some time. He kicked across the gap, knowing that if someone wanted to shoot him from the squid or the wreckage, there was nothing he could do about it. He felt the scrotum-lifting tension he always experienced when he was an obvious target. No shots were fired. Commands and interrogatives squawked in his ears. He could not understand them, did not know where they originated, and, on the whole, thought it best if he stayed out of the dialogue. The clumsiness of the suit almost caused him to miss the squid. He thought briefly that such an anticlimax would be the universe's fitting verdict on his martial pretensions. The brave warrior floating off into near-planet orbit. No maneuvering systems, no propellant, no reaction mass of any sort. Even the pistol was non-recoil. He would end his life as useless and harmless as a child's runaway balloon. Kassad stretched until his joints popped, caught a whip antenna, and pulled himself hand over hand to the squid's hull. Where the hell was the airlock? The hull was relatively smooth for a spacefaring vessel, but was decorated with a riot of designs, decals, and panels announcing what he assumed were the ouster equivalents of "No Step" and "Danger, Thruster Port." No entrances were visible. He guessed that there were ousters on board, a pilot at least, and that they were probably wondering why their returning commando was crawling around the hull like a spavined crab rather than cycling the airlock. Or perhaps they knew why and were waiting inside with drawn pistols. At any rate, it was obvious that no one was going to open the door for him. The hell with it, thought Kassad, and shot out one of the observation blisters. The ousters kept a tidy ship. Not much more than the equivalent of a few lost paper clips and coins geysered out with the ship's air. Kassad waited until the eruption had died down and squeezed through the gap. He was in the carrier section, a cushioned hold looking a lot like a jump rat bay of any dropship or APC. Kassad made a mental note that the squid probably held about 20 ouster commandos in full vacuum combat gear. Now it was empty. An open hatch led to the cockpit. Only the command pilot had remained on board, and he was in the final process of unbelting when Kassad shot him. Kassad pushed the body into the carrier section and strapped himself into what he hoped was the command chair. Warm sunlight came through the blister above him. Video monitors and console holos showed scenes from dead ahead, astern, and shoulder camera glimpses of the search operation inside. Kassad caught a glimpse of the nude body in operating room 3 and several figures in a firefight with surgical lasers. In the holodramas of Fedmahn Kassad's childhood, heroes always seemed to know how to operate skimmers, spacecraft, exotic EMVs, and other strange machinery whenever the need arose. Kassad had been trained to handle military transports, simple tanks and APCs, even an assault boat or dropship if he was desperate. If stranded on a runaway force spacecraft, a remote possibility, he could find his way around the command core sufficiently to communicate with the primary computer or put out a distress call on a radio or fat line transmitter. Sitting in the command chair of an ouster squid, Kassad did not have a clue. That was not quite true. He immediately recognized the remote grip slots for the squid's tentacle manipulators, and given 2 or 3 hours of thought and inspection, he might have figured out how several other controls. He did not have the time. The forward screen showed 3 spacesuited figures jumping for the squid, firing as they came. The pale, oddly alien head of an ouster commander suddenly materialized on the hollow console. Kassad heard shouts from his bubble ear patches. Globules of sweat hung in front of his eyes and streaked the inside of his helmet. He shook them away as best he could, squinted at the control consoles, and pushed several likely-looking surfaces. If there were voice command circuits, override controls, or a suspicious ship's computer, Kassad knew he was screwed. He had thought of all of this in the second or two before he shot the pilot, but had not been able to think of a way to coerce or trust the man. No, this had to be the way, though Kassad, even as he tapped more control surfaces. A thruster began firing. The squid pulled and tugged at its moorings. Kassad bounced back and forth in his webbing. "Shit!" he whispered, his first audible comment since he had asked the force medic where the ship was putting in. He strained far enough forward to get his gauntleted fingers into the grip slots. 4 of the 6 manipulators released. 1 ripped off. The final one tore away a chunk of bulkhead from the HS Merrick. The squid tumbled free. Video cameras showed 2 of the spacesuited figures missing their jumps, the third clutching at the same whip antenna which had saved Kassad. Knowing roughly where the thruster controls were now, Kassad tapped in a frenzy. An overhead light came on. All of the holoprojectors went dead. The squid commenced a maneuver which incorporated all of the most violent elements of pitch, roll, and yaw. Kassad saw the spacesuited form tumble past the overhead blister, appear briefly on the forward video screen, become a speck on the aft screen. The ouster was still firing energy bolts as he, or she, became too small to see. Kassad struggled to stay conscious as the violent tumbling continued. Various voice and visual alarms were screaming for his attention. Kassad tapped at thruster controls, considered it a success, and pulled his hands away when he felt as if he were being pulled apart in only 2 directions rather than 5. A random camera shot showed him that the torch ship was receding. Good. Kassad had no doubt that the ouster warship could destroy him at any second, and that it would if he approached or threatened it in any way. He did not know if the squid was armed, personally doubted if it would carry anything larger than anti-personnel weapons, but he knew beyond a doubt that no torch-ship commander would allow an out-of-control shuttlecraft to come anywhere near his ship. Kassad assumed that the ousters all knew by now that the squid had been hijacked by the enemy. He would not be surprised, disappointed, but not surprised, if the torch ship vaporized him at any second, but in the meantime he was counting on 2 emotions that were quintessentially human, if not necessarily ouster human: curiosity and the desire for revenge. Curiosity, he knew, could be easily overridden in times of stress, but he counted on a paramilitary, semi-feudal culture like the ousters to be deeply involved with revenge. Everything else being equal, with no chance to hurt them further and almost no chance to escape, it would seem that Colonel Fedmahn Kassad had become a prime candidate for one of their dissection trays. He hoped so. Kassad looked at the forward video display, frowned, and loosened his harness long enough to look out the overhead blister. The ship was tumbling, but not nearly so violently as before. The planet seemed closer. One hemisphere filled the view above him, but he had no idea how close the squid was to atmosphere. He could read none of the data displays. He could only guess what their orbital velocity had been, and how violent a re-entry shock would be. His one long glimpse from the wreckage of the Merrick had suggested to Kassad that they were very close, perhaps only 500 or 600 clicks above the surface, and in the kind of parking orbit which he knew preceded the launching of dropships. Kassad tried to wipe his face and frowned when the tips of the loose gauntlet fingers tapped at his visor. He was tired. Hell, only a few hours earlier he had been in fugue, and just a few ship weeks before that he had almost certainly been body dead. He wondered if the world below was Hyperion or Garden. He had been to neither, but knew that Garden was more widely settled, closer to becoming a hegemony colony. He hoped it was Garden. The torch ship launched 3 assault boats. Kassad saw them clearly before the aft camera panned beyond range. He tapped at the thruster controls until it felt as though the ship was tumbling more quickly toward the wall of planet above. There was little else he could do. The squid reached atmosphere before the 3 ouster assault boats reached the squid. The boats undoubtedly were well armed and well within range, but someone on the command circuit must have been curious. Or furious. Kassad's squid was in no way aerodynamic. As with most ship-to-ship craft, the squid could flirt with planetary atmospheres, but was doomed if it dove too deeply into the gravity well. Kassad saw the telltale red glow of re-entry, heard the ion build-up on the active radio channels, and suddenly wondered if this had been such a good idea. Atmospheric drag stabilized the squid, and Kassad felt the first tentative tug of gravity as he searched the console, and the command chair arms for the control circuit he prayed would be there. A static-filled video screen showed one of the dropships growing a blue plasma tail as it decelerated. The illusion created was similar to that encountered when one skydiver watched another open his chute or activate his suspension rig. The assault boat seemed to climb suddenly. Kassad had other things to worry about. There seemed to be no obvious bailout controls, no ejection apparatus. Every Force space shuttle carried some sort of atmospheric egress device. It was a custom dating back almost 8 centuries to when the entire realm of spaceflight consisted only of tentative excursions just above the skin of old Earth's atmosphere. A ship-to-ship shuttle probably would never need a planetary bailout device, but age-old fears written into ancient regulations tended to die hard. Or so the theory went. Kassad could find nothing. The ship was quaking now, spinning, and beginning to heat up in earnest. Kassad slapped open his harness release and pulled himself toward the rear of the squid, not even sure what he was looking for. Suspension packs? Parachutes? A set of wings? There was nothing in the troop carrier section except the corpse of the ouster pilot and a few storage compartments not much larger than lunch boxes. Kassad tore through them, finding nothing bigger than a med kit. No miracle devices. Kassad could hear the squid shaking and beginning to break up as he hung on a pivot ring and all but accepted the fact that the ousters had not wasted money or space on such low-probability rescue devices for their squids. Why should they? Their lifetimes were spent in the darknesses between star systems. Their concept of an atmosphere was the 8-click pressurized tube of a can city. The external audio sensors on Kassad's bubble helmet began to pick up the raging hiss of air on the hull and through the broken blister in the aft section. Kassad shrugged. He had gambled too many times and lost. The squid shuddered and bounced. Kassad could hear the manipulator tentacles tearing away from the bow. The ouster's corpse suddenly was sucked up and out of the broken blister like an ant into a vacuum cleaner. Kassad clung to the pivot ring and stared through the open hatch at the control seats in the cockpit. It struck him that they were wonderfully archaic, like something out of a textbook of the earliest spacecraft. Parts of the ship's exterior were burning away now, roaring past the observation blisters like gobbets of lava. Kassad closed his eyes and tried to remember lectures from Olympus Command School on the structure and layout of ancient space-going craft. The squid began a terminal tumble. The noise was incredible. "By Allah!" gasped Kassad, a cry he had not uttered since childhood. He began pulling himself forward into the cockpit, bracing himself on the open hatch, finding handholds on the deck as if he were climbing a vertical wall. He was climbing a wall. The squid had spun, stabilized in a stern-first death dive. Kassad climbed under a 3G load, knowing that a single slip would break every bone in his body. Behind him, atmospheric hiss turned to a scream, and then to a dragon roar. The troop carrier section was burning through in fierce, molten explosions. Climbing into the command seat was like negotiating a rock overhang with the weight of two other climbers swinging from his back. The clumsy gauntlets made his grip on the headrest even less sure, as Kassad hung over the vertical drop to the flaming cauldron of the carrier section. The ship lurched. Kassad swung his legs up, and he was in the command seat. The display videos were dead. Flame heated the overhead blister to a sick red. Kassad almost lost consciousness as he bent forward, his fingers feeling in the darkness below the command seat. Between his knees there was nothing. Wait, a hand grip. No, sweet Christ and Allah! A D-ring! Something out of the history books. The squid began to break up. Overhead, the blister burned through and spattered liquid perspex throughout the interior of the cockpit, splashing Kassad's suit and visor. He smelled plastic melting. The squid was spinning as it broke up. Kassad's sight turned pink, dimmed, was gone. He used numb fingers to tighten the harness. Tighter. Either it was cutting into his chest or the perspex had burned through. His hand went back to the D-ring, fingers too clumsy to close around it. No. Pull. Too late. The squid flew apart in a final screech and an explosion of flame, the control console tearing through the cockpit in 10,000 shrapnel-sized bits. Kassad was slammed into his seat, up, out, into the heart of the flame. Tumbling. Kassad was dimly aware that the seat was projecting its own containment field as it tumbled. Flame was centimeters from his face. Pyrobolts fired, kicking the ejection seat out of the squid's blazing slipstream. The command seat made its own track of blue flame across the sky. Microprocessors spun the seat so that the disk of the force field was between Kassad and the furnace of friction. A giant sat on Kassad's chest as he decelerated across 2,000 kilometers of sky at 8 gravities. Kassad forced his eyelids open once, noted that he lay curled in the belly of a long column of blue-white flame, and then he closed his eyes again. He saw no sign of a control for a parachute, suspension pack, or any other braking device. It did not matter. He could not move his arms or hands in any case. The giant shifted, grew heavier. Kassad realized that part of his helmet bubble had melted or been blown away. The noise was indescribable. It didn't matter. He closed his eyes more tightly. It was a good time to take a nap. Kassad opened his eyes and saw the dark shape of a woman bending over him. For a second he thought it was her. He looked again and realized it was her. She touched his cheek with cool fingers. "Am I dead?" whispered Kassad, raising his own hand to grip her wrist. "No." Her voice was soft and throaty, burred with the hint of an accent he could not place. He had never heard her speak before. "You're real?" "Yes." Kassad sighed and looked around. He lay naked under a thin robe on some sort of couch or platform set in the middle of a dark, cavernous room. Overhead, starlight was visible through a broken roof. Kassad raised his other hand to touch her shoulder. Her hair was a dark nimbus above him. She wore a loose, thin gown which, even in starlight, allowed him to see the outlines of her body. He caught her scent, the fragrant hint of soap and skin and her that he knew so well from their other times together. "You must have questions," she whispered as Kassad released the gold clasp which held her gown in place. The gown whispered to the floor. She wore nothing underneath. Above them, the band of the Milky Way was clearly visible. "No," said Kassad, and pulled her to him. Toward morning a breeze rose, but Kassad pulled the light cover over them. The thin material seemed to preserve all of their body heat as they lay together in perfect warmth. Somewhere sand or snow rasped at bare walls. The stars were very clear and very bright. They awoke at the first hint of dawn, their faces close together under the silken coverlet. She ran her hand down Kassad's side, finding old and recent scars. "Your name?" whispered Kassad. "Hush!" she whispered back, her hand sliding lower. Kassad moved his face into the scented curve of her neck. Her breasts were soft against him. Night paled to morning. Somewhere sand or snow blew against bare walls. They made love, slept, made love again. In full light they rose and dressed. She had laid out underwear, grey tunic and trousers for Kassad. They fit perfectly, as did the sponge socks and soft boots. The woman wore a similar outfit of navy blue. "Your name?" Kassad asked as they left the building with the shattered dome and walked through a dead city. "Moneta," said his dream, "or Mnemosyne, whichever name pleases you more." "Moneta," whispered Kassad. He looked up at the small sun rising into a lapis sky. "This is Hyperion?"
"Yes."
"How did I land? Suspensor field? Parachute?"
"You descended under a wing of gold foil."
"I don't hurt. There were no wounds?"
"They were tended to."
"What is this place?"
"The city of poets, abandoned more than 100 years ago. Beyond that hill lie the time tombs."
"The Auster assault boats that were following me?"
"One landed nearby. The Pain Lord took the crew unto himself. The other two set down some distance away."
"Who is the Pain Lord?"
"Come."
said Moneta. The dead city ended in desert. Fine sand slid across white marble half buried in dunes. To the west an Auster dropship sat with its portals irised open. Nearby, on a fallen column, a therm cube yielded hot coffee and fresh baked rolls. They ate and drank in silence. Kassad worked to recall the legends of Hyperion. "The Pain Lord is the Shrike," he said at last.
"Of course."
"You're from here, from the city of poets?" Moneta smiled and slowly shook her head. Kassad finished his coffee and set the cup down. The feeling that he was in a dream persisted, much stronger than during any sim he had ever participated in. But the coffee had tasted pleasantly bitter. The sun was warm on his face and hands.
Come, Kassad, said Moneta.
They crossed expanses of cold sand. Kassad found himself glancing skyward, knowing that the Auster torch ship could lance them from orbit, then knowing with a sudden certainty that it would not. The time tombs lay in a valley. A low obelisk glowed softly. A stone sphinx seemed to absorb the light. A complex structure of twisted pylons threw shadows onto itself. Other tombs were silhouettes against the rising sun. Each of the tombs had a door, and each door was open. Kassad knew that they had been open when the first explorers discovered the tombs, and that the structures were empty. More than 3 centuries of searching for hidden rooms, tombs, vaults, and passageways had been fruitless.
This is as far as you go,
Moneta said as they neared the cliff at the head of the valley.
The time tides are strong today.
Kassad's tactical implant was silent. He had no comlog. He searched his memory. There are anti-entropic force fields around the time tombs, he said.
Yes.
The tombs are ancient. The anti-entropic fields keep them from aging.
No, said Moneta. The time tides drive the tombs backward through time.
Backward through time, Kassad repeated stupidly.
Look.
Shimmering, mirage-like, a tree of steel thorns appeared out of the haze and a sudden dust storm of ochre sand. The thing seemed to fill the valley, rising at least 200 meters to the height of the cliffs. Branches shifted, dissolved, and reformed like elements of a poorly tuned hologram. Sunlight danced on 5-meter-long thorns. Corpses of Auster men and women, all naked, were impaled on at least a score of these thorns. Other branches held other bodies. Not all were human. The dust storm obscured the view for a moment, and when the wind subsided the vision was gone.
Come, said Moneta.
Kassad followed her through the fringes of the time tides, avoiding the ebb and flow of the anti-entropic field the way children would play tag with an ocean surf on a broad beach. Kassad felt the pull of the time tides like waves of déjà vu tugging at every cell of his body. Just beyond the entrance to the valley, where hills opened to the dunes and low moors led to the city of poets, Moneta touched a wall of blue slate, and an entrance opened to a long, low room set into the cliff face. "Is this where you live?" asked Kassad, but saw immediately that there were no signs of habitation. The stone walls of the room were inset with shelves and crowded niches.
We must ready ourselves,
whispered Moneta, and the lighting shifted to a golden hue. A long rack lowered its wares. A wafer-thin strip of reflective polymer curtained from the ceiling to serve as a mirror. Kassad watched with the calm passivity of a dreamer as Moneta stripped off her clothes, and then his. Their nudity was no longer erotic, merely ceremonial. "You have been in my dreams for years," he told her.
Yes, your past, my future. The shock waves of events moves across time like ripples on a pond.
Kassad blinked as she raised a gold ferule and touched his chest. I don't know what a ferule is. Ferule. I assume it's like it's a dingus of some kind. He felt a slight shock and his flesh became a mirror, his head and face a featureless ovoid reflecting all the color tones and textures of the room. A second later, Moneta joined him, her body becoming a cascade of reflections, water over quicksilver over chrome. Kassad saw his own reflection saw his own reflecting reflection in every curve and muscle of her body. Moneta's breasts caught and bent the light. Her nipples rose like small splashes on a mirrored pond. Kassad moved to embrace her, and felt their surfaces flow together like magnetized fluid. Under the connected fields, his flesh touched hers.
Your enemies await beyond the city, she whispered.
The chrome of her face flowed with light. Enemies?
The ousters, the ones who followed you here.
Kassad shook his head, saw the reflection do likewise. They're not important anymore.
Oh, yes, whispered Moneta. The enemy is always important. You must arm yourself.
With what? But even as he spoke, Kassad realized that she was touching him with a bronze sphere, a dull blue toroid. His altered body spoke to him now as clearly as troops reporting in on an implant command circuit. Kassad felt the bloodlust build in him with turgid strength.
Come.
Moneta led the way into open desert again. The sunlight seemed polarized and heavy. Kassad felt that they were gliding across the dunes, flowing like liquid through the white marble streets of the dead city. Near the west end of town, near the shattered remnants of the structure still bearing the inscribed lintel of Poets' Amphitheatre, something stood, waiting. For a second, Kassad thought it was another person wearing the chromium force fields he and Moneta were draped in, but only for a second. There was nothing human about this particular quicksilver over chrome construct. Kassad dreamily noted the four arms, retractable finger blades, the profusion of thorn spikes on the throat, forehead, wrists, knees, and body, but not once did his gaze leave the 2,000-faceted eyes which burned with a red flame that paled sunlight and dimmed the day to blood shadows. The Shrike, thought Kassad.
The Lord of Pain, whispered Moneta.
The thing turned and led them out of the dead city. Kassad approved of the way the ousters had prepared their defenses. The two assault boats were grounded less than half a kilometer apart, their guns, projectors, and missile turrets covering each other, and a full 360 degrees of fire. Ouster ground troops had been busy digging revetments 100 meters out from the boats, and Kassad could see at least two EM tanks hull down, their projection arrays and launch tubes commanding the wide, empty moor between the poet's city and the boats. Kassad's vision had been altered. He could see the overlapping ship containment fields as ribbons of yellow haze, the motion sensors and anti-personnel mines as eggs of pulsing red light. He blinked, realizing that something was wrong with the image. Then it came to him. Besides the thickness of the light and his enhanced perception of the energy fields, nothing was moving. The ouster troops, even those set in attitudes of motion, were as stiff as the toy soldiers he had played with as a boy in the Tharsis slums. The EM tanks were dug into their hull-down positions, but Kassad noticed that now even their acquisition radars, visible to him as concentric purple arcs, were motionless. He glanced skyward and saw some sort of large bird hanging in the sky, as unmoving as an insect frozen in amber. He passed a cloud of wind-blown dust hanging suspended, extended one chrome hand, and flicked spirals of particles to the ground. Ahead of them, the Shrike strode casually through the red maze of sensor mines, stepped over the blue lines of trip beams, ducked under the violet pulses of the auto-fire scanners, passed through the yellow containment field and green wall of the sonic defense perimeter, and walked into the assault boat's shadow. Moneta and Kassad followed.
How is this possible?
Kassad realized that he had posed the question through a medium that was something less than telepathy, but something far more sophisticated than implant conduction.
He controls time.
The Pain Lord?
Of course.
Why are we here? Moneta gestured toward the motionless ousters.
They are your enemies.
Kassad felt that he was finally awaking from a long dream. This was real. The ouster trooper's eyes, unblinking behind his helmet, were real. The ouster assault boat, rising like a bronze tombstone to his left, was real. Fedmahn Kassad realized that he could kill them all, commandos, assault boat crew, all of them, and they could do nothing about it. He knew that time had not stopped, any more than it stopped while a ship was on their hucking drive. It was merely a matter of varying rates. The bird frozen above them would complete the flap of its wings given enough minutes or hours. The ouster in front of him would close his lids in a blink if Kassad had the patience to watch long enough. Meanwhile, Kassad and Moneta and the Shrike could kill all of them without the ousters realizing that they were under attack. It was not fair, Kassad realized. It was wrong. It was the ultimate violation of the new Bushido, worse in its way than the wanton murder of civilians. The essence of honor lay in the moment of combat between equals. He was about to communicate this to Moneta when she said/thought, "Watch." Time began again with an explosion of sound not unlike a rush of air into an airlock. The bird soared and circled overhead. A desert breeze threw dust against the static charged containment field. An ouster commando rose from one knee, saw the Shrike and the two human shapes, screamed something over his tactical comm channel, and raised his energy weapon. The Shrike did not seem to move. To Kassad it merely ceased being here and appeared there. The ouster commando emitted a second, shorter scream, and then looked down in disbelief as the Shrike's arm withdrew with the man's heart in its bladed fist. The ouster stared, opened his mouth as if to speak, and collapsed. Kassad turned to his right and found himself face to face with an armored ouster. The commando ponderously lifted a weapon. Kassad swung his arm, felt the chrome force field hum, and saw the flat of his hand cut through the body armor, helmet, and neck. The ouster's head rolled in the dust. Kassad leaped into a low trench and saw several troopers begin to turn. Time was still out of joint. The enemy moved in extreme slow motion 1 second, jerked like a damaged holo to 4/5 speed in the next instant. They were never as quick as Kassad. Gone were his thoughts of the new Bushido. These were the barbarians who had tried to kill him. He broke one man's neck, stepped aside, jabbed rigid, chrome fingers through the body armor of a second man, crushed the larynx of a third, dodged a knife blade moving in slow motion, and kicked the spine out of the knife wielder. He leaped up out of the ditch.
Kassad!
Kassad ducked as the laser beam crept past his shoulder, burning its way through the air like a slow fuse of ruby light. Kassad smelled ozone as it crackled past. Impossible. I've dodged a laser. He picked up a stone and flung it at the ouster manning the tank-mounted hell whip. A sonic boom cracked. The gunner exploded backward. Kassad pulled a plasma grenade from a corpse's bandolier, leapt to the tank hatch, was 30 meters away before the explosion geysered flame as high as the assault boat's prow. Kassad paused in the eye of the storm to see Moneta in the center of her own circle of carnage. Blood splashed her, but did not adhere, flowing like oil on water across the rainbow curves of chin, shoulder, breast, and belly. She looked at him across the battlefield, and Kassad felt a renewed surge of bloodlust in himself. Behind her, the Shrike moved slowly through the chaos, choosing victims as if he were harvesting. Kassad watched the creature wink in and out of existence and realized that to the Pain Lord, he and Moneta would appear to be moving as slowly as the ousters did to Kassad. Time jumped, moved to 4/5 speed. The surviving troops were panicking now, firing into one another, deserting their posts, and fighting to get aboard the assault boat. Kassad tried to realize what the past minute or two had been like for them. Blurs moving through their defensive positions, comrades dying in great gouts of blood. Kassad watched Moneta moving through their ranks, killing at her leisure. To his amazement, he discovered that he had some control of time. Blink, and his opponent slowed to 1/3 speed. Blink, and events moved at nearly their normal pace. Kassad's sense of honor and sanity called out for him to stop the slaughter, but his almost sexual bloodlust overpowered any objections. Someone in the assault boat had sealed the airlock, and now a terrified commando used a shaped plasma charge to blow the portal open. The mob pressed in, trampling the wounded in their flight from unseen killers. Kassad followed them in. The phrase, fight like a cornered rat, is an extremely apt description. Throughout the history of military encounters, human combatants have been known to fight at their fiercest when challenged in enclosed places, where flight is not an option. Whether in the passageways of La Haye Sainte and Hougoumont at Waterloo, or in the hive tunnels of Lusus, some of the most terrible hand-to-hand battles in history have been fought in cramped spaces where no retreat is possible. It was true this day. The ousters fought and died like cornered rats. The Shrike had disabled the assault boat. Moneta remained outside to kill the 30 commandos who had stayed at their posts. Kassad killed those within. In the end, the final assault boat fired on its doomed counterpart. Kassad was outside by then, and he watched the particle beams and high-intensity lasers creep toward him, followed an eternity later by missiles which seemed to move so slowly that he could have written his name on them in flight. By that time, all of the ousters were dead, in and around the overrun boat, but its containment field held. Energy dispersion and impact explosions tossed corpses around on the outer perimeter, set fire to equipment, and glazed the sand to glass. But Kassad and Moneta watched from inside a dome of orange flame as the remaining assault boat retreated to space. Can we stop them? Kassad was panting, pouring sweat, and literally quivering from excitement.
We could, replied Moneta, but we do not want to. They will carry the message to the swarm.
What message?
Come here, Kassad.
He turned at the sound of her voice. The reflective force field was gone. Moneta's flesh was oiled with sweat. Her dark hair was matted against her temples. Her nipples were hard.
Come here.
Kassad glanced down at himself. His own force field was gone. He had willed it away, and he was more sexually excited than he could ever remember being.
Come here,
Moneta whispered this time. Kassad went to her, lifted her, felt the sweat-slick smoothness of her buttocks as he carried her to an empty stretch of grass atop a wind-carved hummock. He lowered her to the ground between piles of ouster bodies, roughly opened her legs, took both her hands in the grasp of one of his, and lifted her arms above her head, pinned them to the ground, and lowered his long body between her legs.
Yes,
whispered Moneta as he kissed the lobe of her left ear, set his lips to the pulse of the hollow of her neck, licked the salt tang of sweat from her breasts. Lying among the dead, more dead to come, the thousands, the millions, laughter out of dead bellies, the long lines of troops emerging from jump ships to enter the waiting flames.
yes.
Her breath was hot in his ear. She freed her hands, slid them along Kassad's damp shoulders, trailed long nails down his back, grasped his buttocks to pull him closer. Kassad's erection scraped her pubic hair, throbbed against the cusp of her belly. Farcaster portals opening to admit the cold lengths of attack carriers, the warmth of plasma explosions, hundreds of ships, thousands dancing and dying like dust motes in a whirlwind. Great columns of solid ruby light lancing across great distances, bathing targets in the ultimate surge of warmth, bodies boiling in red light. Yes! Moneta opened her mouth and body to him, warmth above and below, her tongue in his mouth as he entered her, welcomed by warm friction. His body strained deep, pulled back slightly, allowed the moist warmth to engulf him further as they began to move together. Heat on 100 worlds, continents burning in bright spasms, the roll of boiling seas, the air itself aflame, oceans of superheated air swelling like warm skin, rising to a lover's touch. Yes, yes, yes. Moneta breathes warmth against his lips. Her skin is oil and velvet. Kassad thrusts quickly now, the universe contracting as sensation expands, senses dwindling as she closes warm and wet and tight around him. Her hips thrust harshly in response now, as if sensing the terrible build in pressure at the base of his being. Demanding. Kassad grimaces, closes his eyes, sees fireballs expanding, stars dying, suns exploding in great pulses of flame, star systems perishing in an ecstasy of destruction. He feels pain in his chest, his hips not stopping, moving faster, even as he opens his eyes and sees the great thorn of steel rising from between Moneta's breasts, almost impaling him as he unconsciously pulls up and back the thorn blade, drawing blood which drips on her flesh, her pale flesh, reflective now, flesh as cold as dead metal, with hips still moving even as he watches through passion-dimmed eyes, as Moneta's lips wither and curl back, revealing rows of steel blades where teeth had been. Metal blades slash at his buttocks where fingers had gripped. Legs like powerful steel bands imprison his pumping hips. Her eyes. In the last seconds before orgasm, Kassad tries to pull away. His hands on her throat, pressing. She clings like a leech, a lamprey ready to drain him. They roll against dead bodies. Her eyes like red jewels, blazing with a mad heat like that which fills his aching testicles, expanding like a flame, spilling over. Kassad slams both hands against the soil, lifts himself away from her, from it. His strength insane, but not enough as terrible gravities press them together, sucking like a lamprey's mouth as he threatens to explode, looks in her eyes, the death of worlds. The death of worlds. Kassad screams and pulls away. Strips of his flesh rip away as he lunges up and sideways. Metal teeth click shut in a steel vagina, missing his glands by a moist millimeter. Kassad slumps on his side, rolls away, hips moving, unable to stop his ejaculation. Semen explodes in streams, falls on the curled fist of a corpse. Kassad moans, rolls again. Curls in a fetal position, even as he comes again. And again. He hears the hiss and rustle as she rises behind him. Kassad rolls on his back and squints up against sunlight and his own pain. She stands above him, legs apart, a silhouette of thorns. Kassad wipes sweat from his eyes, sees his wrist come away red with blood, and waits for the killing blow. His skin contracts in anticipation of the slash of blade into flesh. Panting, Kassad looks up to see Moneta above him, thighs flesh rather than steel, her groin matted from the moisture of their passion. Her face is dark, the sun behind her, but he sees red flames dying in the multifaceted pits of her eyes. She smiles, and he sees sunlight glint on rows of metal teeth. she whispers, and it is the sound of sand scraping against bone. Kassad tears his gaze away, struggles to his feet, and stumbles across corpses and burning rubble in his terror to be free. He does not look back. Scouting elements of Hyperion's self-defense force found Colonel Fedmahn Kassad almost 2 days later. He was discovered lying unconscious on one of the grassy moors which led to the abandoned Kronos Keep, some 20 kilometers from the dead city and the wreckage of the Auster ejection pod. Kassad was naked and almost dead from the effects of exposure and several serious wounds, but he responded well to emergency field treatment and was immediately airlifted south of the Bridle Range to a hospital at Keats. Reconnaissance squads from the SDF battalion moved northward carefully, cautious of the anti-entropic tides around the time tombs, and wary of any booby traps left behind by the ousters. There were none. The scouts found only the wreckage of Kassad's escape mechanism and the burned out hulks of the 2 assault boats which the ousters had lanced from orbit. There were no clues as to why they had slagged their own ships, and the ouster bodies, both in and around the boats, had been burned beyond any hope of autopsy or analysis. Kassad regained consciousness 3 Hyperion days later, swore that he remembered nothing after stealing the squid, and was shipped out on a force torch ship 2 local weeks later. Upon returning to the web, Kassad resigned his commission. For a while he was active in anti-war movements, occasionally appearing on the All Thing net arguing disarmament, but the attack on Brescia had mobilized the hegemony toward true interstellar war as had nothing else in 3 centuries, and Kassad's voice was either drowned out or dismissed as the guilty conscience of the butcher of South Brescia. In the 16 years after Brescia, Colonel Kassad had disappeared from the web and from the web consciousness. Although there had been no more major battles, the ousters remained the hegemony's prime boogeyman. Fedmahn Kassad was only a fading memory. It was late morning when Kassad finished his story. The consul blinked and looked around him, noticing the ship and its surroundings for the first time in more than 2 hours. That checks out. The Benares had come out into the main channel of the Hooghly. The consul could hear the creaks of the chains and hawsers as the river mantas surged against their harnesses. The Benares appeared to be the only ship heading upriver, but now numerous small craft were visible going the other way. The consul rubbed his forehead and was surprised to see his hand come away slick with sweat. The day had grown very warm, and the shadow of the tarp had crept away from the consul without his noticing. He blinked, wiped sweat from his eyes, and moved into the shade to get a drink from one of the liquor bottles the androids had set in a cabinet near the table.
My God, Father Hoyt was saying. So, according to this Moneta creature, the time tombs are moving backward in time?
Yes,
Said Kassad. Is that possible? Asked Hoyt.
yes.
It was Saul Weintraub who answered. If that's true, said Braun Lamia, then you met this Moneta, or whatever her real name is, in her past, but your future, in a meeting that's still to come.
Yes,
Said Kassad.
Martin Silenus walked to the railing and spat into the river.
Colonel, do you think the bitch was the Shrike?
I don't know. Kassad's monotone was barely audible. Silenus turned to Saul Weintraub.
You're a scholar. Is there anything in the Shrike mythography that says the thing can change shape?
No, said Weintraub. He was preparing a milk globe to feed his daughter. The infant made soft, mewling noises and moved tiny fingers.
Colonel,
said Het Mastine. "The force field, whatever the fighting suit was, did you bring it with you after the encounter with the ousters and this female?" Kassad looked at the Templar a moment, and then shook his head. The consul was staring into his drink, but his head suddenly snapped upright with the force of a thought. "Colonel, you said that you saw a vision of the Shrike's killing tree, the structure, the thing where it impales its victims." Kassad moved his basilisk stare from the Templar to the consul. He slowly nodded. "And there were bodies on it." Another nod. The consul wiped sweat from his upper lip. "If the tree is traveling backward in time with the time tombs, then the victims are from our future." Kassad said nothing. The others also were staring at the consul now, but only Weintraub appeared to understand what the comment meant, and what the consul's next question had to be. The consul resisted the urge to wipe the sweat from his lip again. His voice was steady. "Did you see any of us there?" Kassad said nothing for more than a minute. The soft sounds of the river and the ship's rigging suddenly seemed very loud. Finally, Kassad took a breath. "Yes." Silence stretched again. Braun Lamia broke it. "Will you tell us who?" "No." Kassad rose and went to the stairway leading to the tower decks.
Wait,
called Father Hoyt. Kassad paused at the head of the stairway.
will you tell us at least two other things?
"What?" Father Hoyt grimaced from a wave of pain. His gaunt face went white under its film of perspiration. He took a breath and said,
First, do you think the Shrike, the woman, somehow wants to use you to start this terrible interstellar war you foresaw?"
"Yes," Kassad said softly.
Second, will you tell us what you plan to petition the Shrike for, or this Moneta, when you meet them on this pilgrimage?"
Kassad smiled for the first time. It was a thin smile, and very, very cold. "I will make no petition," said Kassad. "I will ask nothing of them. When I meet them this time, I will kill them." The other pilgrims did not speak or look at one another as Kassad went below. The Benares continued north-northeast into afternoon. And that was The Soldier's Tale, The War Lovers, from Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Hopefully people dug it. That one is all wham bam thank you ma'am in just about every sense of the word. Let's see, where are we? Where is the next one? Where does it end? That's not too bad. That's only 264 pages. 100. It's only 64 pages, I think. Wait, did I miss a chapter break? Does it really go from one straight into the next? No, it doesn't. It can't do. There we go. It's not that many. It's 50 pages. There we go. So yeah, we will. I don't know if I'll do it next week or not. Next Wednesday, I mean. I know this is becoming unpredictable because not all of these are all that. Here we go. How long is that? Okay, so next week, tentatively, because the next interlude is like 2 pages long. Tentatively next week we'll just do the one stream, probably Friday. I may change my opinion on that and be like, hell with it, just do it Wednesday and call it. What was the interlude after that one? It was like, that's under 15 pages. How long is the non-interlude after that?
That one is, oh, that one's beefy. That one's really beefy. That one's like 70 pages long. Okay. Um, there's no easy way to do this, sadly, because they aren't predictable.
They'd be predictable if you know, took notes the last time you read it. That'd be great. Take notes, Frig. Take notes.
The postlude of that chapter. What is that? Yeah, okay, that's not very long. Okay, yeah, because the one, this next one is important. The one after that is also, they're all important. Um, geez, because 70 pages is kind of a doozy. Yeah, I'll probably do the interlude on that one. And that reduces that down to a much more manageable 55 or so. Where's that? There's the other bookmark. I knew I had like, I have like 3 bookmarks in this book at any given time. It's crazy. Yeah, so yeah, that'll make the interlude. Yeah, I'll continue doing a Wednesday, Friday schedule then, for doing Hyperion. Mondays will, as of next Monday, be still Mecha Mondays, but we're going to be doing Mecha literature for like a year and see how that goes. First up will be the novelization of Mobile Suit Gundam by Yoshiyuki Tomino and what's his name? Yes. There it is. There it is. Where are you?
Get over here. Get over here.
He's just the one credited. As translated by some guy, Frederick L. Short, with an introduction by Mark Simmons. It's not a super long book, but it's not terribly short either. So we'll see how that goes. So that'll be interesting. So people who enjoy basically next year is going to be full-time reading streams, just about. That's the plan going forward. Um, and you'd think, oh, how can Frag possibly do 52 weeks worth, give or take, 52 weeks worth of mecha literature? Trust and believe that, haha, it's not going to be hard. I mean, geez, like this one will take like probably 5-6 weeks to get through, maybe a little less depending on how quickly I bang through it. I've got dozens of other mecha adjacent literature we can do. Hell, I can maybe take the time to finally get through to do Starship Troopers by Heinlein and Armor by Stakely. Jim Stakely? John Stakely, which, power armor fiction. That's mecha adjacent. Among others, there's plenty of other choices. I might also try to do the first 2 Yuki Kaze novels, which are great. I just learned that there was a 4th one released in Japan by the author Chohei Kanbayashi just last year. Um, more things that we will never get translated into English, ever, ever. We will never. If we're not going to get the 3rd one, we're not going to get the 4th one. I can't remember their titles offhand, but the first 2 are there, and they're quite cool. Mostly, I want to see where he goes with his ideas as an author. There's some really cool stuff in the first and second novel, respectively. Very off-putting. Like he has this very dry way of portraying events. Part of that's the translation. The translation's kind of dry, um, but the author is also kind of dry in the way he portrays things, sort of formal and stiff, um, but very detailed where it counts. But also has some pretty great ideas. It's sort of like Philip K. Dick by way of who's another good cross comparison. I'm not sure. springs to mind? Maybe some military sci-fi author. I'd say John Ringo, but no, not like John Ringo. It's funny because I read a bunch of John Ringo. I have a bunch of John Ringo books, and then you kind of learn that the dude's a bit of a head ass, and you sort of start backing off. Also, because it was getting really difficult to keep track of some of his series, because they were getting like there's one of them that has at least 12 books, and half of them are by him, and half of them are like co-written by other people. Although one of them does have mechs in it, so I might do that. That's a co-written one, and it doesn't sound very much like his work. It's okay. I think that's A Day on Mars, Once Upon a Time on Mars, something like that. I can't remember the title. I'll have to dig it out. Anyway, so that's the plan going forward. Is Mondays will still be Mecha Mondays, but it's going to be Mecha literature. Might do some BattleTech novels. We'll see if we have time. Some of those are very pulpy. Uh, and yeah, other than that, Monday, Wednesday, Friday are all reading days. Mondays are Mecha Mondays. Wednesdays are Wordy Wednesdays. And Fridays are Free Read Fridays. For this weekend, I'll get the Hyperion playlist all set up and filled out with the stuff we've got here. Um, so there will be less confusion there. I realize this is sort of going to seem like a bid to increase audience engagement or something. This is kind of a shift I've been sort of edging towards for the last year or two, when it had become very clear that the entire reason I started streaming was becoming the reason to keep streaming. So, no joke, like the entire idea behind me getting started doing any of this, even though I was doing, something robot related, something Warframe related, and then a reading stream every week. It was always about the reading streams, and I know that sounds like revisionist history, but it's the honest to God truth. Um, so it's or honest to Shrike truth, as the case may be. Um, so it was always kind of the goal, and I'm glad that people latched onto the part that I am most wanted to do. So that pleases me to no end. As always, if you've got anything you want read, holler it out. Um, yeah, and these are all done live Monday, Wednesday, Friday, starting about noon Eastern Standard Time. So if you want to catch me live, feel free to tune in. If you don't want to catch me live and just listen to them after the fact, go for it. I don't care one way or another. I'm glad when people tune in live. I'm glad when people watch them at all. So yeah, thanks. Um, Other than that, stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. And don't let the night shrikes bite or put you on his tree of thorns. Alrighty, until next time, bye bye. Have fun.